As the countdown begins to the 21st century, it's good to know there is still one number you can always count on.
Hopefully you've got one dang good movie.
In life, you can be certain of three things: death, taxes, and that die-hard fans of The World Is Not Enough will describe it as the most underrated film in the whole James Bond series. Pierce Brosnan's third film as 007 was released in 1999 to a relatively mixed reception, and that mass critical assessment has never really changed over the years. This isn't an On Her Majesty's Secret Service, a Bond film that has been re-evaluated and grown in prestige in the years since its release. But the film does have something of a dedicated following amongst the Bond fandom, as well as general fans of Brosnan's era as the agent, and I firmly count myself amongst those numbers. On my latest Bond movie ranking, I rated the film at number 5, and based on this ranking, you can probably deduce one thing about me: that I was kicked in the head by a horse. Or alternatively, that I am a millennial. I was a child of the 1990s, and I was getting into James Bond around the time of the millennium. And generally speaking, I think that Bond fans tend to hold two films from the series in special places in their hearts: the first one that they ever saw, and the one that was new around the time they were becoming a Bond fan. And considering those two films for me were Moonraker and The World Is Not Enough, it does go some way to explaining my particular taste when it comes to Bond films. The World Is Not Enough came out just 2 years after Tomorrow Never Dies. Now, that film was still a big success at the box office. It's a film that I hold very dear also, but there's no two ways about it. The production was about as chaotic as Shirley Bassey hitting the high note from Goldfinger in a glass manufacturer's warehouse. The fact they came out of that production with something even vaguely resembling a completed film is something to be commended. Tomorrow Never Dies is a fun action thrill ride, but I don't think it's unfair to say that it is perhaps lacking somewhat in the character department. Bond has a small emotional storyline with Paris Carver, but that's wrapped up early on, and so the filmmakers sought to remedy this, with Brosnan himself seemingly leading the charge about wanting some serious, dramatic, and meaty scenes to sink his acting chops into.
Well, I think what they were looking for, both the producers, Pierce, and to a lesser extent the studio, who basically what they want is just a Bond film, was something which was a bit more dramatic than the others had been, that they wanted to beef up the stuff between the action sequences.
This certainly explains why the producers chose Michael Apted to direct the film, a man who, by his own admission, had never directed a film on the grand scale of a Bond before, but his films previously had secured Oscar nominations for Sigourney Weaver in Gorillas in the Mist, Jodie Foster in Nell, as well as a full-blown Oscar win for Sissy Spacek for The Coal Miner's Daughter, so this should give you a good indication of what Eon were looking for by hiring Michael Apted. They wanted a man who could direct drama, who could bring out exceptional performances from his lead actors, and would primarily be focused on the film's emotional arcs. In many ways, the shift in focus more onto character and emotional storytelling is something of a precursor to what we'd experience in a much bigger way in the Daniel Craig era. And The World Is Not Enough does seem to have inspired some of the Daniel Craig films in more ways than others, but more on that in a little while. That's not to say, though, that The World Is Not Enough is lacking in gigantic action set pieces, though. It's an adrenaline-inducing ride right from the off, and features some of my own favourite action sequences in the entire series. To me, The World's Not Enough is something of a perfect package of a Bond film. But why so much love for this seemingly mediocre entry in the Bond filmography? Well, that is what this video is going to be all about. Good evening, Mr. Bond fans, and welcome to this in-depth review, retrospective, and celebration of the 19th Bond film, The World Is Not Enough. The film begins with a pretty damn pitch-perfect gun barrel sequence. I've talked about this before, but I just adore Pierce's gun barrel. It's the same one used on all 4 of his films, and I can understand why there would be no real reason to refilm it. This is just, I mean, everything about it is perfect, from the performance to the look of the barrel. It's flawless, and the David Arnold score music in this film's instance in particular just perfects the whole thing. We're not even 30 seconds into the film, and I'm already in love with it. The iris then opens directly on the impossibly handsome bastard face of Pierce Brosnan as James Bond. So far the only time in the series that this has happened, and I'll admit it does kind of contribute to the cut-to-the-chase nature of this first part of the pre-credits sequence. At one time this was the longest pre-credits in the entire series, and as the filmmakers know that the show-stopping amazing thing that everyone is going to remember is the boat chase on the Thames that's coming up, things during this Bilbao sequence do have a bit of expediency to them. By the way, gotta love this crowd of onlookers visible in the background here, but I especially like this lady who's just creeping around the corner here, clearly enjoying herself watching watching Pierce Brosnan crossing the road. I've often wondered if she's a paid extra or indeed just some lady that lived there and was waiting for the shot to hurry up and finish so she could go about her day. Anyway, Bond is here to meet with a Mr. Lachaise, a Swiss banker who is currently holding a large amount of money belonging to oil baron Sir Robert King for Bond to retrieve, but you don't just send out James Bond for a mere errand like this. Oh no, it turns out that the money was used to buy a stolen report from the Russian Atomic Energy Department that King believed would identify the terrorist that attacked a new pipeline he's building. A fellow MI6 agent was killed in and amongst the report changing hands, so that's why Bond is here. Brosnan is on an excellent form right from the off here. This is his third film as the character, and he fits into the role absolutely effortlessly at this point. Love some of the little mannerisms, his double taking the cigar girl like, oh hey, you're hot, and I just love his attitude and the staging throughout this sequence. Bond gets sat down and he's surrounded by Lachaise and his men who are all stood up and around him, so they appear domineering and they think that they have the upper hand, but Bond of course has a gadget up his sleeve, a flashbang concealed in his gun, and is activated by a button on his spectacles. Bond of course gets the upper hand with this, and I just love this icy stare he gives to the camera, though admittedly it's a borderline fourth wall breaking moment and a bit of an unmotivated one. Like, okay, I mean, he shot this one random goon, and I wouldn't have thought that that particular action would be worthy of a pause for an icy glare to the audience. If Bond got into the habit of doing that for every person he's killed, the length of these films would treble at least. Bond interrogates Lachaise for the name of the person who killed the MI6 agent, and after a brief moment where Lachaise seems to genuinely consider that immediate death here might actually be beneficial to giving up the name, he's about to spill but is knifed in the back of the head by the cigar girl, who has an excellent aim with that throwing knife, I must say. She'd clearly boss it on the throwing knives only weapon set on GoldenEye multiplayer.
Can't we play with Moonraker lasers just once?
The cigar girl escapes, and the gunshots from earlier have alerted the police, so Bond must MacGyver his way out of the office window by using some elastic from the window blinds and an unconscious goon as a weight. I always really enjoy this moment, the Bond theme kicking in, Brosnan looking awesome, but Bond is damn lucky that Lachaise installed industry-strength window blinds in his office for the thing to just not completely snap under his weight. Come on, blasted thing! Bond is observed by some slack-jawed onlookers, which is always a classic happenstance in this series, though I'd have had them all carrying open bottles of booze and double-taking if I was in charge. Bond makes it away with the money as the film moves to the MI6 headquarters in London. Just an extra little tidbit about this sequence before we move on. As Bond is figuring out a way to escape, one of Lachaise's goons is sniped by an unseen force from the other side of the street. On a first viewing, you might well assume that the escaping cigar girl might be responsible, though that would have required her to get across the street in record time, but given her incredible knife-throwing abilities, I would also believe that maybe she was just really into parkour ahead of the game and somehow flung herself to another building, picked up a sniper and saved Bond that way. But no, later in the film we will learn that this was actually the handiwork of the villainous Renard, and this would have been explicit early on in the film if this deleted scene had been kept in.
What's his name? Our friend from MI6.
James Bond.
One of M's more resourceful tin soldiers.
He could identify me.
Then I suppose a death is in order. His.
This would also mean that the character would have been introduced to the audience 45 minutes ahead of his eventual introduction later on in the film. Director Michael Apted talks about this in the behind the scenes, that the scene was cut because, well, firstly, the pre-credits sequence was already incredibly long and exposition heavy, so they needed to cut it down, but also because the next time in the film that we see Renard in the flesh is in this really cool location. He's doing some really good villainous monologuing, so it made for a more impactful introduction. Anyway, on we go. The money is returned to MI6. Always loved this edit, by the way, as the money scanner cuts to the door opening on Moneypenny. I've always found that very aesthetically pleasing. And hey, we get a proper traditional Bond Moneypenny flirting scene here. Hurrah! I've always really enjoyed Brosnan's chemistry with Samantha Bond, and to be perfectly honest, they're on par with Connery and Maxwell for me in terms of Bond and Moneypenny screen chemistry. It's just a shame that this is really the only film in Brosnan's 4-film run that they get to have this kind of classic repartee. I love the scene in GoldenEye and how it subverts That's the classic formula with Moneypenny out of hours and being called back to the office from the date that she was on, and I like the banter that they have in Tomorrow Never Dies too, but it's more like jibes rather than flirting, and, well, in Die Another Day, the only time the two characters are in the same scene in that film is when one of them is actually a hologram, so this is really the only time that they're together in this traditional setup in Brosnan's run. But yeah, the innuendo they get out of the cigar canister, Bond slowly leaning in like he's about to kiss her, Moneypenny's little smirk and sparkling eyes. I think this is a really, really lovely scene. Bond is then swiftly called into M's office, where he walks in on his boss giggling and sharing some whiskey with Sir Robert King. Must be great being the head of MI6. All she does is drink. This is the third film in a row she's guzzling down some liquor while on the clock. She must stagger home after work every day if this is how she's carrying on. Sir Robert leaves to collect his money, and I really like how Brosnan plays this scene. He and M are talking about Sir Robert and the fact that he was actually buying stolen documents, and Bond is a little judgmental here. He knows that King is far from being completely above board and that M is turning a blind eye to some of his potential indiscretions because, well, she's mates with the guy.
He's a man of great integrity.
We'll buy stolen reports for £3 million. Thank you.
Like, I love how she doesn't even dignify his comment with a response. She just makes that face which totally telegraphs, "Shut the fuck up, 007. The pair are musing about who exactly could have been the sniper that killed the goon in Lachez's office, thus ensuring that Bond could escape alive, before Bond notices something white and sticky on his fingers. Exactly what were you and Sir Robert up to on this desk before I arrived? And while we won't find out the true nature of this foaming until later, it does tell Bond that something is up with King and the money, and so he charges through MI6 after the billionaire. Bond is of course too late, and something in King's lapel pin triggers an explosion within the money itself. I could not begin to describe to you how big a deal it was for me watching this film as a kid that MI6 itself is attacked in this way. Just the idea that the seemingly impenetrable fortress of Secret Service intelligence would be subject to an explosion like this was such a big deal. It raised the stakes higher than I felt they had been in any Bond film prior. And while in Bond films since this one, the building has been subject to more attacks, it's been subject to more villainous scheming, but I still think that it holds a great deal of impact in The World Is Not Enough. The manner in which it is attacked, I think it's a super exciting sequence, and as I say, it certainly telegraphs all bets are off from this point on. The Cigar Girl proves to be an incredibly thorough henchperson, given that she made sure she was in the vicinity and packing heat in case the explosion didn't do its job. It's a little contrived that she'd be there, really, and not really explicitly stated in the film why she's there, and it's very lucky for her, or indeed unlucky, that of all people, Bond is the one to pop his head out of the gaping hole the explosion created in the side of MI6. But whatever contrived headcanon reason you need to come up with to justify Cigar Girl's reasoning for being in London here, who cares, because now we can all enjoy one of the greatest action sequences in all of Bond as 007 commandeers Q's fishing boat and gives chase along the Thames. This is such a tremendous sequence, and one that I never tire of watching. It's a wonderful, exciting medley of stunts and action, with almost all of it done on location, and while stunt drivers were of course utilised for both of the main boats in the scene, the fact that Pierce Brosnan himself is quite clearly driving the Q boat himself for so much of this really does lend a huge amount of believability and credibility. The fact that he himself is being doused with bucket loads of Thames water is insane, and actually the prospect of accidentally intaking any amount of water from the Thames might well be the most dangerous stunt ever performed by a Bond actor in any one of these films. But my god, I'm so happy Brosnan was willing to take that bullet, because damn, it really does take this sequence to the next level, seeing him actually doing so much of this.
Last time I did this was on a lake. It was a nice, calm, straight, flat lake. Today's the Thames, so I have no idea what to expect. I mean, it could be a bit hairy.
Highlights from the whole sequence for me include the barrel roll, of course, as well as the moment where Brosnan adjusts his tie while underwater. Apparently that was the actor's own suggestion, and it's such a cute little moment, and honestly, I just love seeing an action sequence of this scale on the Thames and in London in a Bond film. When I was seeing this film for the first time, I wasn't living in London in the years since I moved to the city, and I, to this day, cannot walk alongside the Thames without half expecting the Q boat to zip by at any moment. moment. Though, fun fact, a good bulk of this sequence is actually filmed on a variety of waterways and canals that either connect to or are adjacent to the Thames, presumably because filming in these spots was more convenient logistically. I mean, it's a real nice bit of movie magic that so many of these locations can be edited together so seamlessly and it just flows, considering they're really dotted around all over London and there's no way that boats would actually be able to drive between so many of these different locations as they do in the film. It does make for a fun trip around the east side of the city as well, if you ever want to visit a load of these spots. A lot of these locations were still kind of new when the film was first made. The whole dockside area had been rejuvenated somewhat, so it's perhaps unsurprising that 25 years on, a bunch of these places still look exactly the same. There are definitely more skyscrapers and new blocks of flats on the skylines though, and I was slightly surprised to see that, well, I guess that the kayak boathouse that Bond blasts through at one point was built specifically for the film, or at least I guess it was, though. I have no idea what the purpose of this space is without such a building, though. And I have to feel sorry for the residents of this particular location who relied on this bridge as part of their day-to-day commute. Heck, if the filmmakers knew that it wasn't to be a permanent structure, they could have blown it up for the film. The chase escalates to the point that Bond must pursue on land in order to catch up with the cigar girl, and in typical Bondian fashion, he does so by way of massive collateral damage, ruining the catch of the day for an entire fishmonger's market, tearing through a rather lovely-looking bistro, and finally ruining someone's beautiful Millennium Dome view meal of red wine and profiteroles. A crying shame, as I can personally testify to there being few other places in London as wonderful for some Merlot and a shoe pastry chaser. I just love this look from the cigar girl when she realizes that Bond has actually caught up with her. She's like, really? As Bond fires a couple of torpedoes at her. Continuity error regarding the order in which the missiles are fired has bothered me throughout my life and to this day, but whatever, the cigar girl makes the logical choice in the situation and heads to the nearest hot air balloon to escape in that instead. It's what we'd all do in similar circumstances, I'm sure. Always slightly bothers me too how her boat sounds like a fart when it explodes here. Now, maybe this is a super realistic bit of sound design. Maybe this is exactly how a speedboat of that kind would sound if it was exploded in such a manner. But to me, all I can hear is a whoopee cushion. However, I'm totally unbothered by the fact that there is just a hot air balloon prepped and ready to go for the cigar girl to commandeer. It's a London to Paris by hot air balloon experience, apparently. The Millennium Dome sure do go all out with these things. In a totally awesome move, Bond flings himself from a mid-air Q-boat to grab a rope dangling from the balloon to pursue the girl into the air. He then proceeds to plead with the cigar girl to come into MI6 custody, but she prefers suicide and proceeds to blow up the balloon, leading Bond to tumble down onto the roof of the Millennium Dome. Always just adored this shot, by the way, with Bond falling and the flames and debris of the balloon just above him. It's so awesome. The impact severely injures Bond's shoulder, but he comes out of the ordeal alive before tumbling into the film's opening title sequence almost 15 minutes since the start of the film. Similar to the reasons for deleting the Renard in Bilbao scene, there are a whole bunch of deleted scenes from the MI6 sequence and the Thames boat chase. These are all viewable on the Blu-ray and on the 2-disc Ultimate Edition DVD, and it's honestly some of my favourite deleted material to watch from any Bond film that has been released. There's some extra conversation between Bond and M in the office about the nature of the stolen reports, which admittedly is a little wordy and complicated and probably wise to cut down on, but I always love this little additional bit of dialogue in and amongst the exposition.
Well, contrary to what you may believe, 007, the world is not populated by madmen who can hollow out volcanoes, fill them with big-breasted women, and threaten the world with nuclear annihilation.
It only takes one.
There's also a bunch more of Bond running around MI6 trying to stop King from getting to the money, and I just love seeing more of MI6, to be perfectly honest. I'd have been more than happy if most of this material was kept in the final film, including Bond's little "ah shit" muttering under his breath here. Also, just want to shout out to this actor, Tom Chadbon, who ended up being removed from the final cut of The World Is Not Enough, but still got his moment to shine in a Bond film eventually, as 7 years later he'd appear as the Chief's stockbroker in Casino Royale, so swings and roundabouts, eh? There's also a bunch that was cut from the boat chase sequence. The river police were originally involved, and there were a whole load of gags that were probably wisely excised, to be honest. It wouldn't surprise me if these were all filmed with the idea that, okay, we'll film a load of these and just cherry pick one or two to be kept in the final film, because really the only overt gag left in the whole sequence is Bond splashing these traffic wardens, and even then that was a bit of a weird, you had to be there at the time kind of cameo, I guess, because, not that I don't think many people remember this now, but one of these guys is Ray Brown, who was a bit notorious at the time in Britain for featuring in the BBC fly-on-the-wall documentary series Clampers about parking wardens. So they got him to do this bit, and back in 2002 a TV special was put together called Best Ever Bond. It was really cool. I remember counting down the days until this thing was going to be on TV. I was so excited about it, but it was a countdown of the best Bond film moments ever to that point, as voted for by the public. The boat chase from The World Is Not Enough came second, behind the laser scene from Goldfinger, and they actually got Ray Brown on the show for a couple of snippets about his role in the film.
The clamper was my idea. I always like having little moments the audience can relieve the pressure. Knowing everybody dislikes clampers, especially this particular one.
They told me to play a cameo role of myself. They were very vague at the start to tell me exactly what was going to happen to me.
And he was sort of saying to me, now what sort of reaction would you like when the water comes over me? I said, I'd just act naturally. I think it'd be okay. He was just so relaxed, he thought he was going to get some splashes on him, you know.
And the boat just came right at the side of the water, and the water just lifted me, and I was mesmerised. I had no idea where I was. Pile of mash.
It's definitely an of-its-time cameo, and not something I could imagine the series going in for these days. I think that the Bond films see themselves as being a bit classier than that sort of thing these days. They don't need cameos from reality TV stars, Instagram influencers, or even YouTube content creators, no matter how many times you might write into Eon head office with your brilliant idea about being a Q branch background extra with a badge that says science fact on it. But yeah, of the extra gags that you see in the deleted material, I think it's fine enough that they were cut. I don't think we needed the additional bit with Bond having to dodge a cute puppy, or this bit with the pissed off undertipped waiter grumbling outside the restaurant before Bond goes crashing into it. But the man playing the waiter here is Terry Bamber, who was the film's location production manager, and he has worked on a whole load of Bond films, and you can actually see a short featurette about his work on the Quantum of Solace Blu-ray, which is pretty cool. But me being me, I'd have obviously kept in the oblivious drunk man who was inside the restaurant. But hey, for what the final product ended up being, it's still an absolutely top-tier Bond pre-credit sequence for me. Just a absolute blast to watch every time I see this boat chase. It's then that the film sachets into the main titles, just over 14 minutes into the film. Now, it's commonly reported that the film's pre-title sequence was never planned to include the boat chase originally, so the titles would have come immediately after the Bilbao scenes. The story is often reported that test audiences were unimpressed when they saw that edit, when the showcase pre-title stunt was Bond jumping out of a not especially high window, so the whole opening of the film was re-edited to show the incredible boat chase scene before the titles. Director Michael Apted himself corroborates this version of events in the behind-the-scenes material.
I had a big problem with the opening of the movie, and it became clear the problem when I first previewed it. And the way the film was originally structured, the Bilbao scene, that was originally the pre-title sequence. When I previewed the film, the Bilbao scene really just didn't cut it. People thought, what? That's the opening of a Bond film? So I knew I'd made a mistake, and so what I knew was also that Thames chase was a really fabulous scene. And so I then had to do some quick thinking, because I decided to make that whole sequence, Bilbao and the Thames chase, the beginning of the film, the pre-title of the film, so that when Pierce falls on the Millennium Dome, then you cut to the titles. Well, that meant you couldn't have a title sequence or pre-title sequence on for 20-25 minutes, so I had to do some very, very tough cutting in that area to give us a real stand-up, grandstandy opening.
So I was a little surprised when reading the film's script to see that the boat chase sequence was actually placed before the main titles on the page. And I'm not just talking about the shooting script here, but also in two previous versions, including the very first draft written by Neil Purvis and Robert Wade, which features so many things that were changed for the final film, including the fact that Bond was originally wearing a jetpack to chase the cigar girl through London rather than driving the Q-boat. But something that remains unchanged is that the pre-title sequence ends with the cigar girl dying in a ball of flames, and then we go to the main titles. So if it was always going to be this way from the page, why has this questionable bit of trivia persisted throughout the years, and why has the director seemingly corroborated this version of events in his testimonies?
The Bilbao scene, that was originally the pre-title sequence. When I previewed the film, the Bilbao scene really just didn't cut it.
If I had to hazard a guess, I'd say that maybe the idea that the boat chase wasn't intended to be a part of the pre-credits has so permeated the behind-the-scenes trivia for this film that it has become a Mandela effect kind of thing that even the film's director is convinced of. Or perhaps more likely, maybe this was a decision made in editing when trying out different cuts of the films. They may well have placed the titles immediately after the Bilbao scenes, and then they might have tested that version, and test audiences didn't like it, so they reverted back to what was originally scripted. Something that I do think you lose by having the chase sequence prior to the main title credits, though, is the surprise and shock that something as big as an attack on MI6 itself happens. Especially at this point in the series, MI6 was really just the place where exposition happened, where Bond collected his gadgets and/or did a bit of moneypenny flirting, and I think that had this sequence come after the main titles, we would have indeed thought, oh, okay, this is the usual briefing scene where Bond gets his mission and so on, like in so many other films, and then it's all flipped on its head and we're caught off guard by immediately being flung into another amazing action sequence. Now, obviously, I've seen this film 5,000 times. I don't even need to watch the film anymore. I have it so burned into my retinas. But by having the scene here, I think that it does telegraph that, yeah, you are expecting something more to come, because we always have a big stunt or bit of action immediately before the main titles. So I think that the additional surprise of that is perhaps lost for those on a first-time viewing. Just in summary, before I promise we will move on to the rest of the film, I've spent so long talking about this pre-title sequence, but this is my favourite pre-titles in all of Bond. It's one of my favourite action sequences in all of Bond. I am never not amazed by the stunt work, the David Arnold score, seeing Brosnan in the boat himself. Maybe I'm just nostalgic for the turn of the millennium, but I love that this whole thing climaxes at the Millennium Dome. It's the 1999 Millennium Bond film taking place here, and it's just so perfect. I'm just absolutely in love with this whole sequence. And if you think that's over-enthusiastic, we have almost 2 more hours of movie to go, folks! Into the title sequence now, once again created by Daniel Kleinman. The theme here is oil, because of course the King family business is going to be a rather central plot element, and we see lots of silhouettes of dancing women coated in the stuff. There's lots of colour here from that rainbow effect you get when oil spills in a puddle, which I really like. It lends a kind of psychedelic element to the whole thing. Total sidebar, when I was a kid, I lived around the corner from like a car repair shop, garage kind of thing, and I had to go past it to and from school every day, and I remember being fascinated, like after it had rained and the oil had leaked into the puddles, I'd be fascinated by these colourful puddles that would just appear, and I remember my mum explaining to me from a very early age that that's because the oil gets into the water and that's what creates this kind of like rainbow effect. And so I do have memories of when I see this film for the first time when I was a kid, thinking that, oh, this is going to have something to do with car repairs at a certain point. I was wondering if the King family business would have been a series of car repair shops, which would have certainly been a different way to go about it. That'll cost you 800 quid and we won't be able to get the part until next Thursday. Accompanying the titles is the film's title song, performed by Garbage, and I don't think that this song gets enough love when compared to other Bond songs, but it's always been a favourite for me. I like how its melody is present throughout the film's score as well. I love the lyrics to the song. I love how sultry it is before building to a bombastic climax. It was clearly made specifically for this film. It's not just something that was submitted amongst a dozen other entries and stuck on because, well, we need a song and that singer is popular at the moment, so let's go with that. And this is not a slight on songs like Tomorrow Never Dies and Die Another Day. Believe it or not, songs that I do really like, but The World Is Not Enough feels like a more complete musical experience as far as Bond films go, because so much of the melodies from the main title track are embedded in the film's main score. This is, of course, because the film's music composer, David Arnold, co-wrote the song along with Don Black, who had previously worked on Bond songs like Thunderball and Diamonds Are Forever, so there's that classic Bond lineage present here as well, which just makes for a perfect combination as far as I'm concerned. I was lucky enough to see Garbage perform the song live during the 60th anniversary concert at the Albert Hall, and it was genuinely my favourite moment of the night. I loved this song. It was really a once-in-a-lifetime pleasure to see it performed by Garbage, Shirley Manson's wonderful vocals. It was a moment I'll cherish forever, because I really do just adore this song. Anyway, on with the film, and the pace very much slows down for a while, which is understandable considering how breakneck the first 14 minutes are, but MI6 move their headquarters to Scotland, which is conveniently where Sir Robert King is being buried, or at least what's left of him, I guess. The next sequence of scenes can be categorized as funeral, plot, sex, gadgets, plot with a bit of emotion, plot, and finally, plot. It's a big chunk of time to be spending with the MI6 gang, considering that in other films, these exposition scenes are like 2 minutes long and then off Bond goes. As a kid, though, I loved these scenes in this film and how much we got to see of the MI6 crew, and there's an awful lot of them in this film, and we're just kind of hanging out there. It had a real novelty to it at the time. Since then, obviously, many of the Daniel Craig era films have expanded the roles of the MI6 regulars to the point that maybe this doesn't feel like such a novelty anymore, but then, hey, MI6 has been attacked so many times throughout the Craig films that maybe even MI6 being blown up doesn't feel like a novelty to some people these days. Sir Robert's funeral introduces his daughter Elektra, played by Sophie Marceau. She locks eyes with Bond, and I love this little glance from Moneypenny as she clocks them looking at each other. It's such a, oh drat, I thought this was really going to be my moment sort of look. But on with the plot, we have Michael Kitchen back as Bill Tanner from GoldenEye explaining that the bomb that killed King was triggered by the man's lapel pin. The money had been dipped in urea? So it had been treated to act as a kind of fertilizer bomb. It's a complicated bit of detail that, to be honest, I think is treated with just the right level of hand-waving, and this pointed remark from Tanner is really helpful to audience members like me who might have missed the rest of his dialogue after rushing to the dictionary to look at what the hell urea is.
In other words, he set off the bomb that killed him.
Exposition is split between Tanner and a returning Colin Salmon as Robinson from the previous film. It's perhaps a little inelegant that both Tanner and Robinson are here, particularly because the Robinson character was only created for Tomorrow Never Dies because Michael Kitchen, due to scheduling conflicts, couldn't reprise his role as Tanner. However, I do really like Colin Salmon as an actor. I think he is a great addition to these films, and, you know, maybe it just adds to the sense of escalated stakes even more. Like, oh my god, things are so bad that M needs 2 chiefs of staffs. Speaking of M, she's pretty pissed off about the whole thing, given her friendship with King, and highlights how important it is that they find those responsible. Dossiers are handed out to the gathered agents. This film has a real Thunderball vibe to it here, with a bunch of 00 agents assembled, and they're all put on the same case. However, 007 is not given a dossier, though I must say it's a bit rude of him to expect to be handed his before the lady next to him. Where are your manners, Bond?
Ladies first.
Bond is off duty due to his shoulder injury, but keen to get back on the case, Bond does what any reasonable person would do in this situation, and goes to have transactional sex with his workplace medical specialist, Dr. Molly Warm Flash, to be cleared for service. I kinda like how much each character is almost just going through the motions here. It's not a surprise to her that he's doing this. She clearly knew she was treating 007 today by virtue of her decision to wear some slutty underwear, so you get the sense that they've done this before, and they'll do it again, and it works, because 007 is able to get back to work.
Things we do for England. Carry on.
Next up is the Q scene, which is of course most notable for being the long-standing series cast member Desmond Llewellyn's final appearance as the character. It's a beautiful send-off for him, and I consider us Bond fans really very lucky that we got this, to be honest. So many times these familiar faces that pop up throughout multiple Bond adventures are just kind of dropped or recast, or indeed in Bernard Lee's case, sadly passed away in between the films, and this was really the first time the series gave a supporting actor like this a really good definitive send-off, and it's wonderful, a really beautiful moment, and all the more poignant that Llewellyn would sadly pass away after a car accident only 3 weeks after The World Is Not Enough premiered. So I'm glad that the man's contribution to the series and his final appearance in his most famous role could be suitably honoured with a proper bow out.
I'm there until the producers don't want me, and the Almighty does.
The producers that he's there until he doesn't want to do it anymore. That's what they say.
Yeah, well, I'm there until God wants me.
Apparently, the actor had been requesting the filmmakers introduce an assistant character to take on some of the more technical dialogue delivery for a while now, and finally in 1999 they did bring in John Cleese as, well, either R or Q's assistant. The character is named either of those things interchangeably in a lot of the film's related tie-in media. For the sake of brevity, I'm just going to refer to him as R. Now, back when I first saw The World Is Not Enough, to young me, there could have been no greater addition to the Bond film regular cast than John Cleese. I was absolutely obsessed with Fawlty Towers. If there was a film on TV and John Cleese was in it, I would have to watch it. I distinctly remember watching A Fish Called Wanda perhaps a little too early in life, just because he was in it, and he was just the funniest person to ever live as far as I was concerned back then. And I'm still a big fan of the man's work now. I love it every time when I'm watching a film or TV show and he pops up in it. That being said, casting him in a Bond film is a pretty bold move, a statement even. The Q scenes are often comedic, obviously, and Desmond Llewellyn can deliver a funny line and a withering look better than most, but he was not a comedian. Not really even a comedic actor. He was a character actor and a bit player, really, whereas John Cleese is a world-famous comedian, and I think it certainly signals to an audience that, oh, okay, we're going to be going for the comedy even more than usual moving forward. I think Die Another Day would recalibrate that expectation, but clearly here he's in The World Is Not Enough for the laughs. He has a couple of slapstick moments, he gets put down by Q, which is nice. I do genuinely like John Cleese in this film a lot. Just before we move on, another micro moment that I adore, Bond picking up his new X-ray specs from this nameless technician in the background, and the guy's just like, oh, okay, I was working on that, I guess I'll just carry on with something else then. Next up is a bit of plot furthering and character arc development as James Bond scans through multiple documents profiling Elektra King and the details of her kidnapping. Bond makes the connection between the ransom money and the money he retrieved from Bilbao to return to King, but perhaps more importantly, we're supposed to be gleaming from this that Bond is, well, if not falling for Elektra, then at least feeling an overwhelming sense of emotion and protection for her. It's a tricky thing to convey in a really short space of time, and I think that Brosnan is working overdrive to try to sell that, but I do always get a little bit hung up on the fact that Bond has rescued many women and seen women in many perilous situations throughout his career, so why is this one hitting him different? Why is this moving you to try and wipe away tears on a digital screen? I mean, maybe if we'd had a better sense of him trawling through documents for hours and hours, I think maybe I would have been perhaps sold on his fixation on her in this case in particular a bit better. I mean, otherwise, this level of emotion from Bond towards a woman that he hasn't even met at this point in the film feels a little overblown. But hey, you know what? There is a lot going on in this film. I understand the impulse for brevity, and hey, who among us can't say we've fallen in love with people we've never actually met through seeing them in highly emotional states on screens?
Holy shit!
Bond is eventually locked out of Elektra's file, and this leads him to M. Can't let this scene go by without pointing out that, of course, there is a portrait of original M actor Bernard Lee on the wall of M's office here. I think it's a really lovely tribute. Anyway, Bond confronts M, who fesses up that she advised Sir Robert on how to handle the situation regarding his daughter's kidnapping, chiefly that he shouldn't pay the ransom the kidnappers were demanding. I really love Judi Dench in this scene. The balance that she strikes between being this guy's boss and then having to justify her cold and pragmatic decision-making, along with moments where she lets the humanity of the character seep through. I think that she's just pitch perfect here.
You use the girl as bait.
Yes.
Why is there, like, smoke or steam or something coming off of M in this shot? Is it really that cold in the castle that even her farts are coming out as vapor? This is, of course, Judi Dench's third appearance in a Bond film, and it's the first time that they're going to be using her character in a much bigger way. This is the first time, really in the entire series, that M is not just going to be restricted to exposition scenes and sitting behind a desk giving Bond his mission, and then that's it. A detail that has perhaps lost some of its novelty after the Daniel Craig era expanded the role of M, Judi Dench and Ralph Fiennes in pretty significant ways, but hey, here in The World Is Not Enough, I think that they expand the role of M perfectly, and I've always loved how they utilize the character in this story. Bond deduces that the correlation between the ransom money and the money that was returned to King is a message that the terrorist that kidnapped Elektra is back, and this takes us to the next scene, setting up the film's main villain, Renard, played by Robert Carlyle. He's a terrorist out to create chaos, and his special Bond villain quirk is that he has a bullet in his head, put there by a now deceased 009, who was sent to kill the villain. As Dr. Warmflash explains, the bullet will eventually kill Renard as it continues to travel through his head, but until then it will continue to kill off his senses bit by bit.
The bullet will kill him, but he'll grow stronger every day until the day he dies.
I can obviously see what they're going for with this idea. Something similar was toyed with Stamper in the making of the previous film, the idea that his pain receptors were reversed, so pain didn't register as pain. But in Renard's case, I'm not sure that stronger is really the right word for it. I mean, just because the man is losing his senses doesn't mean that he's suddenly invincible. He might not feel his arms getting cut off, but he will still be armless. It also seems like the film only really wants us to focus on the sense of touch. I mean, Dr. Warmflash mentions smell, but sight and hearing don't seem to be an issue for Renard throughout the course of the film. Taste never comes up either, though admittedly that would be a pretty difficult sense to work into the story in a meaningful way.
This Zukovsky caviar is delicious.
I wouldn't know.
Oh, right. Awkward.
Just as an aside, it might be a little too science fiction.
We're not science fiction, we're in fact science fact.
Or indeed science fact, but I love the use of this giant hologram for the briefing. It makes a nice change from just looking over pictures or screens. It is perhaps on the more fantastical leaning end of science fact, but I wouldn't mind if they brought this thing back in the future. I really like it. Also love this shitty little grin that Bond gives when he hears that the Doctor has cleared him, as well as this bitchy innuendo from Moneypenny that totally went over my head as a kid.
I'm sure she was touched by his dedication to the job in hand.
Well, joke's on you, actually, because I used my mouth. Surmising that Renard will be targeting Elektra next, Bond is sent to Azerbaijan to meet with the heiress and protect her, but not to let on that they suspect Renard is going after her. Bond takes his shiny new BMW Z8 to drive to Elektra's remote headquarters. Lovely scenery here of the oil fields before Bond heads into a rather lush forest where we have the UK, Black Park to be precise, doubling for Azerbaijan. By the way, completely blew my mind when I heard that this transition shot where Bond goes from the dry desert kind of landscape into the forest is actually a model shot. I think it's just so insanely good and seamless. Also, where's my remote control BMW Z8 driven by Pierce Brosnan toy? How do they not have these in the stores for Christmas? Bond arrives at the construction site and meets with Elektra's head of security, Davidoff, played by Ulrik Thomsen, who is actually a super accomplished Danish actor. He's here in this really small, like, kind of thankless part, but he's a pretty big star in his own right, and Michael Apted speaks to this in the film's audio commentary, that, like, the power of the Bond brand, the franchise is so big that you can attract really fantastic actors to these small parts, presumably, of course, because these films play on an international stage. These actors can get some extra global recognition through parts in these films where, you know, as acclaimed as 1998's Festen is, and how great this particular actor is in that film, it's not quite gonna get the bums on seats like a new Bond. We're introduced to Elektra more properly here. There's some rioting going on because the current plans for the King Pipeline involve decimating this small sacred site. Elektra meets with the priest and then decides that despite the logistical nightmare and financial burden of doing so, the pipeline design should be altered so it goes around the site. Which is unwelcome news to this construction worker played by British comedian Omid Jalili in a very small bit part. As a real introduction to Elektra, I think that this scene works tremendously well, swooping in the way that she does, looking absolutely stunning, meeting privately with this priest in this pretty amazing location. This is Spain doubling for Azerbaijan now, and this little holy site is just really otherworldly. The fact that the first thing of consequence we see Elektra do in this film is save this place, it gives her this, like, spiritual quality almost. Like, yes, now she is the CEO of this massive oil company, but she's still in touch with her holy side, or at least understands the importance of it to these dozens of people that have turned out, and so she saves it. She sure works her magic on Bond here too, who is observing the situation and meets with Elektra as the locals celebrate. She notably drops into the dialogue here that it was actually her mother's side of the family that discovered oil in the region, and you can file that one under subtle exposition for later. Elektra makes the not unreasonable point that MI6 haven't exactly done great things for the King family in the past, so the fact that Bond is here to protect her is far from reassuring. 007 won't take no for an answer though, so when Elektra announces that she's off to check her pipeline's survey lines, our hero gets suited up for a ski sequence. This is a lovely scene, clearly evoking on Her Majesty's Secret Service. The photography is gorgeous, the music sweeping, and Elektra's outfit highly reminiscent of Bond's deceased wife, Tracy. It turns out that having to check the survey lines involves little beyond having an excuse to ski for a bit and then look at them from afar. She has no documentation with her, she isn't collecting data or photographs. I guess that when you're CEO, you can just decide to do anything and pretend that it's work. But of course, the real reason we're here is to have an incredible action sequence as a kettle of Parahawks descend on our lead characters. I think that this is a really fun bit of action, and I always do have a bit of a soft spot now for snow and ice-based 007 action scenes. It's an excuse to see some fantastic ski stunts. I think in this case, the Parahawks make for fun adversaries. The fact that they can fly around from up high and then just drop down and pursue them on the ground makes for some diverse bits of chasing, which is nice. Always just adored this little moment too, where Bond thinks he has one up on them and he does his typical witticism before realizing his celebration was premature.
See you back at the lodge.
I'm just going to come out and say that I love all of the action sequences in this film, and I love that they're all here, but I appreciate opinions to the contrary that say some of them can feel a little bit arbitrary at times, and I do think that The World Is Not Enough slightly suffers from having a few action sequences where it really does feel like the second unit completely take over, and I very much feel like I'm watching something filmed by a different team that doesn't necessarily combine with the main unit shoot as well as they do in other Bond films. This isn't even a quibble, really, it's just more of an observation, I guess, but there are a couple of bits where I feel a gear shift, and I don't have that with most Bond films. In most cases, it's kind of a seamless thing, but I feel like I don't know if it's just the style of filmmaking changes a bit too much in places here. I just feel that I know that the second unit are behind the camera rather than the first unit. But whatever, who cares, because this action is awesome. I think this film has some wonderfully fiery explosions in it, and shots like this where Bond is skiing away from an erupting fireball behind him are just so much fun. I really do adore this whole sequence. Bond reduces the number of the Powerhawks gradually until only 2 remain. His finishing move is really awesome, using one of his ski poles to create a tear in one of the Powerhawks, and then it goes crashing into another. This shot has always stuck out to me a bit, though. It's Bond inspecting the bit of fabric he just tore off of the Powerhawk sail, but, like, they haven't actually collided yet, so it's always kind of stuck out to me as a little odd that Bond wouldn't even be, like, checking to make sure that his plan actually worked. I don't know, maybe this sequence was swapped around a bit in editing, or maybe indeed we're just supposed to think that Bond is looking really cool here, like, he doesn't even pay attention because he just knows he's gonna succeed anyway. The final explosion causes a little avalanche, which gives Bond an excuse to use his inflatable ski jacket from Q Branch that creates a kind of protective sphere that shields the pair from the worst hits of the avalanche. It's a very niche purpose to dedicate an entire gadget to, really, and remarkable foresight from Q to equip Bond with such a thing on this mission. I don't know if, you know, if I'd have heard that Bond was going to Azerbaijan, my first thought wouldn't have been, oh quick, get him the ski jacket. But this is why Q gets the big bucks, I guess. Actually, his bucks can't be that big, the man's in his 80s and he's still at work in this film. Anyway, being trapped in the sphere is doing no good for Elektra's claustrophobia, and she starts to freak out, so Bond, well, pretty much immediately starts cutting a hole in the sphere. I would have thought that you'd have wanted to let the snow settle a bit first before doing this, but what do you know, it already has. I think that this is a really effective moment between Bond and Elektra, by the way. Her having a panic attack feels very authentic, and I love Brosnan's reactions here, how he plays it with such genuine concern and empathy for her, and then it's like he catches himself, and he suddenly looks stern, like he has to put his wall back up. It's a great bit of acting on both of their parts, I think. I suppose it's up for debate as to whether Elektra is being genuine here, or whether she's faking it as a way to manipulate Bond, given what's going to be revealed later. Personally, I like to think that she's being genuinely fearful for her life here, and Bond does provide some genuine comfort. I think it would just be a bit too Machiavellian, even for Elektra, to imply that absolutely everything she does up until the point of the big reveal is a calculated manipulation. Don't get me wrong, she's a manipulative character, certainly, but I do also think that she genuinely falls for Bond in some perverse way, and so I've always liked to think of this moment as one of a genuine connection between the pair. It's off to Elektra's residence in Baku next, where we get another nice shitty little grin from Bond as Elektra calls him up to her room instead of Davidov.
She wants to see you. Not you, Davidov, him.
She likes me more than you. There's a short exchange between Bond and Elektra here. He refuses to tell her the truth, she shares some of her post-kidnapping trauma, and gets a little flirty. Bond displays an out-of-character level of self-control in not just ravishing her on the bed there and then, and makes his exit later that day, heading to a casino run by his old frenemy, Valentin Zukovsky. Being in the place gives Bond an excuse to try out his X-ray specs, which I have to admit, as a kid, the concept of this was just amazing to me. Like, being able to see through walls and objects, like, so cool. Unfortunately, the effect on screen did not quite match up with my preteen ideas of what X-ray spectacles could be. Rather, the glasses just illuminate concealed weapons beneath a person's clothes, and weirdly, in some cases, they're underwear, but I guess, hey, this is PG-13, am I right? I do love this moment, though, where Bond clocks this lady's butt, though I'm still not quite sure if the gag is supposed to be that he's just enjoying seeing through her dress, maybe she isn't wearing any underwear, or whether we're to believe that this lady has gone to more extreme efforts than others to conceal a weapon away from view. We then get a pretty damn cool instance of the classic 007 drinking order.
Vodka martini. Shaken, not stirred.
I mean, he's just perfect, right? Like, that is James Bond right there. He's so smooth, so cool. Oh my god, I just love Pierce Brosnan in this film. And then Bond is able to use his X-ray specs to gain the upper hand on a Zukovsky bodyguard, which gains the attention of Mr. Bullion, played by Goldie, as if you needed any more evidence that this film was indeed made in the late 1990s. So for those who don't know, Goldie is a British musician, producer, DJ, as well as just a bit of a television personality at this stage, really. So his casting at the time would certainly have been notable to a British audience. Whether you define it as stunt casting or not, I guess, is down to how you perceive Goldie, but I have to say, he suits being here so much. Like, the gold teeth are just perfect. I don't think he's ever supposed to be much of a genuine threat to Bond, but he's a memorable character, and I think he plays the weaselly henchman type really well. And hey, if you're just really desperate to get me to love a Bond film, sticking Robbie Coltrane in it is a surefire way of doing that.
Bond, James Bond.
I love how he says that. He's just like, hey, it's my buddy James. Bringing back Valentin Zukovsky from GoldenEye was just a stroke of genius in my eyes. They could have easily made this into a new character, but the fact that we get Coltrane back as a returning ally, we get to see the character has evolved somewhat, and he's now a legitimate businessman, as he puts it, it's an awful lot of fun. The character certainly seems more affable towards Bond than in GoldenEye. He seems less confrontational. He was more cynical in GoldenEye, but here he's in a happier place and just living his best life. Bond is here because the fabric he ripped off the Parahawk sale was marked with Russian Special Services Atomic Energy Anti-Terrorist Unit branding.
Wow. Now there's a mouthful.
Which, I have to say, seems like a pretty big error on somebody's part. Like, yeah, if you're sending these things out to kill people, maybe just send them out in plain black sails, but hey, Zukovsky is Russian, he has connections, it gives Bond a natural line of investigation. The pair don't get to chat for long, though, before Elektra appears in a sexy red dress. She says she's there to look for the people that tried to kill her, but she's quickly whisked away into a private room by Zukovsky, and we have what is probably my least favourite scene in the whole film. The point of the scene is, it will be revealed later, is that Elektra is making a payoff to Zukovsky here. She gambles $1 million on a one-card high draw game, she loses, she leaves, that's it. It's how quick the whole thing is. It stretches credibility. Like, you don't have to be James Bond to know that something went down here, right? Like, there's not even a back and forth between the characters, or much of an attempt at trying to cover this up by playing multiple rounds, or changing the games, or whatever. I mean, Elektra's kinda just playing it off as like, oh, look at me, I'm so chaotic and damaged. Why don't you fix me with your magical penis, Mr. Bond? I think that the novelization and the January 1999 dated script handle this plot point so much better. In both of those, Elektra and Bond are playing blackjack for a while, so when the payoff to Zukovsky happens, it's in and amongst a whole other gambling scene. You really do get the sense that the characters have been there for a while, whereas in the film, I'm pretty sure that Elektra spends more time waiting for the cloakroom attendant to bring her coat than she does on the casino floor. The fact it's a one-card high draw game too just feels like some needless dumbing down. Like, they clearly wanted the moment to be over with as quickly as possible, and I guess they wanted no one in the audience to be potentially confused by the outcome, so they just made the game as simple as it could possibly be. Lest the audience need a tutorial in blackjack or something. And hey, I guess having been subject to Robinson's nauseatingly detailed breakdown of the game on the PS1 version of The World Is Not Enough, I can perhaps sympathise.
In blackjack, the dealer gives the player 2 cards and deals himself 1 card face up. When the player is done drawing cards, the dealer then draws his 2nd card. The object of the game is to draw cards that...
Next up, we follow Elektra's head of security, Davidov, and his colleague, Dr. Arkov, to a meeting with Renard, who makes his actual physical appearance in the film almost 50 minutes into the running time. I absolutely love this location. It's a fictional place called the Devil's Breath, but based on reality, I guess, like the Devaza gas crater that has been burning for decades due to the natural gas in the ground. It's a really cool idea to introduce Renard to the audience this way. It gives him an excuse to display his severely numbed pain receptors by holding holding a burning rock, and in classic Bond villain form, the scene sees him do away with an underling. I'll talk more about Renard specifically later on, but plot-wise it turns that Dr. Arkov was the one who secured the Parahawks for the mission to try and kill Bond earlier on, but the Parahawks were supposed to be returned, and of course they were destroyed, so Dr. Arkov's in a bit of a pickle. You just know he's the kind of guy who would buy something from a shop, use it once, and then try to get his money back by taking it back the next day.
Yes, I would like my money back on these Parahawks, please. As you can see, I am returning them exactly as I bought them.
Arkov is shot here and has the best death wheeze I think I've ever heard. If the bullet hadn't killed him, it didn't sound like it'd be that long until the chest infection would. Davidov is told to take Arkov's place for the next phase of the plan, and doesn't he just look thrilled with this promotion? Then, in a real scene-missing moment, we cut back to Elektra's house in Baku, where she and Bond are already in bed together. This is something else present in the novelization and in the January 1999 script that I really feel like we could have used in the film. In both of those, we see Bond and Elektra return to the house, and Elektra is going up the stairs, Bond is looking at her, she turns, and they lock eyes, and then they start to passionately kiss on the stairs before we cut to them in bed. Maybe they just didn't want Brosnan making out with a woman on a set of stairs, considering he did the same thing in that year's Thomas Crown affair, and there was no way that scene was going to get beaten, so they decided to just cut to the chase and have them in bed. But I still feel like we're missing the moment where Bond essentially caves to Elektra. He was doing so good at keeping his trousers on and resisting her charm, so I think it would have been helpful to track the moment where he does decide, It's quite a tender romantic scene, though. I think that Brosnan and Marceau are great together here. Elektra is really opening up to Bond emotionally, talking about how she escaped her kidnapping, and she even gets him to express a bit of his own life philosophy.
And what about you? What do you do to survive?
I take pleasure in great beauty.
I think the filmmakers do really well with this scene at selling a more meaningful romance between these two characters than maybe we have seen with Bond and most of the Bond girls. Like I say, I do think that there are some elements that are missing. I think that there are some things that are a little abbreviated, whereas I just kind of wish that the film was even just like 5 minutes longer to really sell some of this stuff a bit better. And, you know, hey, if this were a Craig film, it would be at least 30 minutes longer to explore some of these things. But hey, this was 1999 and Brosnan, and I guess the filmmakers weren't quite ready to take that leap just yet. Fornicating over with, Bond sneaks out to do some spy work. Love his lockpick credit card gadget, and just an example of filmmaking magic. Elektra's house here in these shots is actually just a facade. It's just a giant cutout, as they didn't actually film shots like this in the grounds of the actual building, but it's just so seamless and quite brilliant. I love little physical movie-making tidbits like this. It's during his snooping that Bond finds the body of Dr. Arkov in the boot of Davidov's car. He's presumably able to get rid of the body in record time, as by the time Davidov gets to the airstrip, Bond has taken the corpse's place. I'd love to know where the body of Dr. Arkov ended up. Presumably it's still somewhere in Elektra's grounds. Maybe Bond, he had a Q-branch shovel hidden in his shoe and he had enough time to dig a 6-foot grave for the guy. Heck, it'd be better than what befalls Davidov, who gets shot and then thrown in a skip. If I had a penny for every time James Bond dumped a dead person in a skip, I'd have 2 pennies, but it's weird that it's happened twice. So yes, Bond now takes Davidov's place, who was taking Dr. Arkov's place, and he meets with this Russian guy named Trukin, and I just love this little bit where Bond is really just having to roll with the punches. He doesn't really know where all this is leading, but hey, he's gonna do his best to improvise along, and I kind of like how he half commits to some vaguely Eastern European accent here.
What happened to Davidov? He was buried with work.
Your accent, quite unusual.
Yes, my mother was Irish and my dad was, I want to say, Georgian?
After what must have been a nightmare flight stuck behind these two chain smokers, Bond arrives in Kazakhstan at a nuclear test facility and continues to just roll with the punches. Colonel Akakovich is in charge of the site and greets Bond/Arkov.
Welcome to Kazakhstan, Dr. Arkov. I'm a great admirer of your research.
Not enough of a fan to know what the guy looks like, though, apparently. Anyway, we've gone around 5 minutes of screen time now, where the only people on screen have been middle-aged men, and I don't know about you, but my attention's starting to wane. But this is a nuclear testing facility in the middle of Kazakhstan. I wonder how the filmmakers are going to convincingly get some sexy-ass women into this scenario. Why, by casting Denise Richards as International Decommissioning Authority nuclear physicist Dr. Christmas Jones, of course!
And idiots can do anything we put our minds to.
I played a nuclear psychiatrist in a James Bond movie.
Dr. Jones is the final main character to be introduced to the film, almost an hour into the running time. If you want to know my nauseatingly detailed thoughts on the character, what I think Denise Richards brings to the film, my own journey of appreciation with this character, why I think she's way overhated, then please do check out that video. Long story short, I think of Christmas Jones as an intrinsic part of the DNA of this film, and I think her introduction here provides just the right kind of necessary energy moving forward.
Are you here for a reason? Or are you just hoping for a glimmer?
For the last few minutes, we've had a pretty big stretch of plot and a lot of Bond-Elektra relationship development, which I like and think is very well done, but Christmas Jones brings a different level of fun and camp with her. When I see her hips swaying as she sachets up to Bond in her not-so-thinly veiled Lara Croft ripoff outfit, my heart sings. I am happy to be here. I've said this before, but yeah, I mean, casting Denise Richards, dressing her this way, she's here for the teenage boys, right? And I just want to say I am totally fine with that decision. I like that Christmas Jones is here, and I like that we have this more fun, frivolous character to offset some of the more serious, darker themes that are being explored with Bond and Elektra's romance. I think that they balance each other out just right. I appreciate that there are people out there quick to deride the casting of Denise Richards in this film and her performance, and I'm certainly not here to say that anyone is wrong for holding an opinion contrary to my own, but I will not be saying a bad word about Denise Richards in this film. I think she does great with the material she's given. I do think the writing of the character could have been improved, but more on that later on. Right now, though, Bond and Christmas have some back and forth sniping as they introduce themselves to each other. She's really frosty with him up front and coming out with all of this technical jargon, and I kind of love how Brosnan is playing some of this stuff. I feel like he's the audience surrogate in some of these moments where she's talking and he's looking her up and down like, hey, who'd have thought I'd be getting this kind of lecture from someone who looks so out of place here? Bond heads down into the facility and comes across Renard, who he wastes no time in grabbing and holding at gunpoint, and the pair have a back and forth. Okay, confession time. As much as I obviously adored this film, I'll defend it to the grave, there are a handful of scenes where some of the dialogue becomes a little too flowery for my tastes, and this is one of them.
How sad to be threatened by a man who can't grasp what he's involved in.
Revenge is not hard to fathom for a man who believes in nothing.
A man tires of being executed.
It's the kind of dialogue that I think you can write, I think you can read it on a page and it doesn't stand out, but as soon as you speak it, it's like, who the talks like this? Another slightly hard to swallow element of this particular scene is this bit where Renard repeats Elektra's catchphrase and the filmmakers go into overdrive to make sure that no one in the audience is left behind in realizing that something is up.
There's no point living if you can't feel alive.
Huh? It's such an overdone moment. Brosnan's exaggerated take, the pause. I could have done with the whole thing being dialed back at least a couple of notches. Brosnan is a great actor and he can use very small facial movements to his advantage. He's the kind of actor where even just the slightest brow furrow or twitch of an eye can convey so much. So the fact that here it seems like he was directed almost like one of the Three Stooges doing an incredulous take is, I think, just a bit much. And, you know, it's clearly here for the benefit of the audience members who might have dozed off as it's been more than 20 minutes since our last bit of action. And fine, they're pitching this at people not paying that much attention, but it just kind of plays like a bit of a dumbed down beat for me these days. However, for all my quibbles here, I do love this moment where Brosnan throws Renard to the ground and screws the silencer on his Walther, ready to execute the guy there and then. It's a pretty cold moment, and I love the efficiency that Bond conveys here. It's just a really nice micro moment. Sadly, Renard misses out on an extra bullet in his head to match the first one, as Dr. Jones has done some digging and raises the alarm on Bond.
He's an imposter. Dr. Arkoff is 63 years old.
I've always found it funny that his age is the first thing she cites here as proof that it isn't Dr. Arkoff, especially given that Pierce Brosnan looked hardly any different when he actually reached 63. Dr. Arkoff is 63 years old. Hey, I have a very effective moisturizer routine. But also, I mean, okay, sure, his age is improbable, but what's more improbable is that he's the same guy as in the portrait photo printout you're holding in your hand. Like, she goes for the age first and not the fact that he's clearly a completely different man. He's an imposter. Dr. Arkoff is a much less attractive man. Outgunned and surrounded, Bond surrenders, and crucial plot point moment here, Renard apparently knows of Bond's shoulder injury, as he knows just where to hurt the agent. Renard is keen to crack on, but Colonel Akakevich is not satisfied and demands that everyone goes to the surface, which triggers a firefight in which the Colonel and a load of his men are mowed down. So long, Colonel Akakevich, your screen time is fleeting and your contribution to the plot negligible, but you were deemed enough of a potential marketing draw, apparently, to have a character poster dedicated to you for some reason. Anyway, it's time for some action. Bond and Christmas take shelter while Renard's men attempt to remove the bomb and seal the pair in the chamber. I love this whole sequence so much. It's full of moments that I just adore, like this line from Bond right off the bat.
Who are you?
I work for the British government. Stay calm.
I love him using his watch grapple gadget. This thing would become such a staple of Bond video games along with the laser watch, so it's cool to see him use it in action here. I love that he's able to get a shot in here as he barely makes it through this door, and then him dual-wielding weapons during the firefight is so cool. I love this little railway cart getting cut in half by the sheer power of the door. I love the precision of Bond's bullet hitting the glass with Renard behind it. I love the intercutting back to Christmas Jones trying to get the door back open for Bond just as the bomb goes off, and then he has to ride along on these chains towards it while shouting at her to close it back up again. I love the fiery explosions and how things escalate, and the cherry on top is just one of my favorite renditions of the surname, forename, surname line in the whole series.
Name's Bond. James Bond.
It's all very cheesy and 90s action-y, yeah, I am not denying that, but I am feasting like a king during this sequence. Oh my god, inject it into my veins. I love this stuff. Renard and his men make off with a nuclear warhead as Bond and Dr. Jones escape a fiery demise. Crucially, the locator card from the bomb was removed, though Bond plucked it off a dead henchman, meaning that they cannot trace the device itself. Meanwhile, back in Scotland, M and a bunch of clipboard scribbling staff are trying to ascertain as to where Renard could be heading next. Elektra interrupts proceedings with a video call, asking that M come and take charge of the situation in person. Love this little side eye from M and Tanner here as Elektra mentions that Bond left her place in the middle of the night. But yes, Elektra's plea works and M heads out to meet her. Elektra then gets back to work. Well, I guess. I mean, wow, video calls and working from home in loungewear. Elektra's work ethic was way ahead of its time. It's a pretty cushy gig being the CEO of King Industries, isn't it? You spend your whole day flouncing around in a big dressing gown. Bond appears, having taken down Elektra's bodyguard Gabor with seeming ease. For all of her personal wealth, Elektra really needs to invest in better security beyond these two men. Anyway, this is the scene where Bond confronts Elektra about his suspicions that she could be in league with Renard. He cites Stockholm Syndrome, and we'll come back to that later, but the confrontation ends with a slap and Elektra denying everything, tempering Bond's accusations for the foreseeable. So this might be my second least favourite scene in the whole film. It's an important moment for the plot. You know, Bond saying all this stuff out loud to Elektra. He's clearly feeling betrayed, humiliated, he's hurting. It just feels a bit out of character for him to be confronting her in such a soap opera-like fashion. The fact it ends with a slap as well just seals the soapy feel for me. Michael Apted had directed on British soaps in the past, so maybe some of that influence was coming out here. Watching the scene post No Time to Die, in a lot of ways it reminds me of the scene from that film where Bond confronts Blofeld, where Bond is behaving almost out of character and the actors are making some really off-kilter line-reading choices.
There's no point in living if you can't feel alive. Isn't that right, Elektra? Isn't that your motto?
It's like a testimony to your greatness, a celebration of all that is Ernst Stavro Blofeld.
He and I had a little chat this morning. Knew all about us, knew about my shoulder, knew exactly where to hurt me.
Yeah. But then it all went wrong.
And again, I feel like some of the dialogue here is a little too flowery for my taste.
That animal, that monster? He disgusts me. You disgust me.
And the fact that Bond's line of questioning is just kind of sidelined by Elektra, she's being all like, oh, so you knew Renard was after me this whole time and you didn't say anything, and it's kind of like, okay, but that hasn't really gone any way to relieving any of Bond's specific concerns. It's a bit by the by, but fortunately she has the 1-2 punch of diversion when a phone call comes in telling her that her pipeline has been attacked and several men are dead, and she announces that M will be arriving shortly. Isn't it always a pain at work when you're mid-task task and your boss turns up to micromanage. This takes us to the King facility where the off-screen attack took place, and there are a grand total of 4 short shots in this particular location. And it's kind of funny though how director Michael Apted raves about this building and some of the behind-the-scenes material where he's introducing a deleted scene that was shot at the place.
The last deletion is really, again, just a piece of shoe leather. It just seemed really not to add up to very much, which is a pity because it's a great location. 21st, 22nd century location for that, something really unusual.
So you can imagine my disappointment when I made the trip to Swindon to see this mind-boggling structure with my own 2 eyes, though admittedly the presence of a supermarket across the roundabout didn't exactly contribute towards the visionary, futuristic architecture I was expecting. Coincidentally though, this location is actually only just a 10-minute drive from St. James's Church in Sevenhampton, where James Bond's creator, Ian Fleming, is buried. I wonder if that fact occurred to anyone actually working on the production while they were shooting there, but I thought it was a pretty interesting little tidbit. The deleted scene itself at this location doesn't contribute much towards the film other than perhaps making it all too obvious from the rolling green fields in the background that this is quite clearly not Azerbaijan anymore, but also because Brosnan's accent goes to a bit of a bizarre place.
We hit about 90 minutes ago. There's a scientist here from the International Decommissioning Agency, Dr. Jones. She's checking to see if she can find anything.
Dr. Jones! Calling Dr. Jones! Bond, M, and Robinson enter the control room where Elektra is, and I've always really liked how Dench plays these short shots here. She comes into this room looking like, well, frankly, a long-tailed Persian cat in a room full of rocking chairs, and for the longest time I always thought this was a bit strange. Like, this woman is the head of MI6, why is she looking so nervous here? But then I realised that's kind of the whole point. This version of M, as was introduced in GoldenEye, was referred to then as the evil queen of numbers. She's all about the stats and the data. In this film, she mentions that she studied law at Oxford. Despite being the head of this big intelligence service, I don't feel like we're ever supposed to believe that she was ever out operating in the field, and being in this situation is somewhat intimidating for her. I think that the deleted scene actually makes a bit more of a point of the danger by showing us a bunch of deceased King employees in body bags, which I guess would have contributed to M's feeling a bit on edge here. This is a bit of a contrast to her M from the Craig era, who I do get a bit of a sense of maybe having been a field agent at some point, or at least having some experience out in the field. She certainly has no aversion to travelling, and in Skyfall she makes reference to have never been that good a shot. So I'm not saying that she was ever particularly good out in the field, but she at least had handled a firearm at some point in her career. This version of M, on the other hand, would probably have been more like Tiffany Case if she were to have to fire a weapon. Bond and M have a small scene together where he hands over the locator card he snagged in Kazakhstan and relays his suspicions that Elektra might not be all she seems. Their meeting is cut short by a warning of a rogue observation rig travelling through the pipeline. Bond deduces that it must be carrying the bomb that Renard stole earlier. Either that, or it's a trapped Sean Connery and his rat friend moving at a record-breaking speed. Bond quickly comes up with a plan to intercept the bomb before it reaches the end of the pipeline, requiring Christmas Jones to join as the nuclear weapons expert and Robinson to join as, well, a map reader, basically. Could Bond and Christmas really not have just done that themselves? Obviously, they need Robinson out of the picture so that M can be, spoiler alert, kidnapped in a few scenes' time, but I wish that they'd have had him driving the helicopter or doing something a little bit more to justify his presence here than just literally reading a map and pointing. Anyway, off we go into a, well, I'm reluctant to call it an action sequence, but it's certainly a suspenseful and thrilling scene in which Bond and Christmas zip through the pipeline to defuse the bomb. Certainly by this point in the series run, this was probably the most CGI-heavy scene that they'd ever done. Brosnan and Richards are obviously filming this whole thing on a green screen, but you know, I do think it holds up pretty well. Yes, you can tell it's CGI, but the lighting and wind machines are used really effectively. The shots are mostly nice and close up to the actors, so you feel a sense of claustrophobia. The characters still feel like they're existing in the environment. I can't let this scene go by without commenting again on the phenomenal work of composer David Arnold. Arnold is my favourite Bond composer of everyone who has ever scored a Bond film, and especially his Brosnan scores. Each of these rank among my very favourite movie scores ever, quite frankly, and his track for this particular scene just wraps the whole thing together just absolutely perfectly. It's a track that feels like it's constantly building, it's marking crucial moments, it's suspenseful, it's exciting, adrenaline-inducing, seriously, if you have a deadline, I can't recommend enough playing this track on a loop. It's one hell of a way to motivate yourself. Upon removing the plutonium, it appears that half of it is missing. Bond then has this helpful expository line to explain to clueless members in the audience, like myself, what this actually means.
So what are you saying? You couldn't go nuclear?
Bond prevents Christmas from defusing the bomb completely, and, thinking on his feet, jumps off the rig with Christmas in tow to allow the bomb to explode, and thus make it appear that it killed both of them. Always love this little moment where it's like, Bond catches himself and realizes he should be shielding Christmas from the potential explosion. It's just such a, oh, where are my manners kind of moment. Some brilliant miniature work here again as the bomb goes off. I just love this explosion as well. I love that it kind of caves back in on itself. Anyway, as a result of thinking that she has killed Bond, Elektra reveals to M that it was indeed she who switched her father's lapel pin and manufactured his demise. M's guards and the remaining pipeline worker are killed, and then Elektra goes on to further reveal that she originally intended the money bomb to kill both her father and M, and having failed that, she used Bond as a tool in order to get close to M. M responds to this with a slap, and all we're missing is her bellowing, "Get out of my pub," to complete the soap opera effect before she is kidnapped. Love that Elektra's whole villainous revelation thing depends on M opening this little box, though, and she gives it her immediately after she hears the news that Bond is more than likely dead. M is understandably aggrieved here, and I'd love to know how this would have gone down if she'd have just flat out refused.
He would have wanted you to have it.
Perhaps this isn't the time.
Please.
Later, Elektra, I need to call my people. Just open it. No, I can't. Go on. I'm too upset. It'll only take a second.
He was my best agent.
Oh, fine, I'll do it. Look, it's the damn pin.
Similar to the attack at the heart of MI6 at the very start of the film, the kidnapping of M here, her being so central to the villain's evil plot, had such a fantastic novelty to it back when this film was new. It absolutely blew my mind as a kid. The stakes could only have been higher if the villains had, like, kidnapped the Queen. And, I mean, this is Judi Dench. She's pretty much on the same level as the Queen. It's interesting that it took the films this long to get around to using M in the story in a much bigger way. In the behind-the-scenes material, there are lots of mentions of how a driving factor behind this decision-making was the fact that, well, hey, we got Judi Dench here, and she won an Oscar not that long ago. She's a brilliant actress. Why are we only using her for 2 scenes per movie where she keeps a stony face and barks orders at Bond? Let's get our money's worth out of the woman.
Women are more at the centre in this film. Judi Dench has got a much larger role than she's ever had before because she's such a great actress.
As I keep mentioning, obviously the novelty of this is slightly lesser now, the Craig era, how they expanded Judi Dench and Ralph Fiennes' roles, but this was really, back in the day, I can't emphasize this enough, this was the very first time that M had ever been utilized in the plot in such a big way, and that was incredible to me. I should caveat, on screen at least, by 1999, M had been kidnapped a couple of times in the books, actually. First of all, in the first of the James Bond continuation novels written after Ian Fleming's death, Colonel's Son, and then again in the last of the John Gardner continuation series, 1996's Cold, and though not kidnapped in this instance, M features in a big way in the plot of Raymond Benson's 1998 The Facts of Death, which, funnily enough, was originally to be titled The World's Not Enough before the publishers rejected it on the basis of it not being Bondian. As Benson himself said in an interview talking about this particular decision, go figure. Our heroes emerge from the pipeline wreckage alive, and we have some exposition as Bond gets Christmas up to speed on Elektra's dastardly dealings, but is still stumped about what the villains are actually going to do with the other half of the plutonium. We get this classic line from Christmas Jones as a result.
I have to get it back, or somebody's going to have my ass.
A line that, for reasons of decency, they had to dub for the trailers to replace the word ass.
I have to get it back, or somebody's going to have my butt.
All these years on, it's pretty funny because I don't even think of ass as being a particularly harsh curse word anymore. I can't imagine what string of profanity she'd have to utter these days to get the similar level of censorship.
Or somebody's gonna have my piece of
First things first.
It's also during this scene that we get a hint at a backstory for Dr. Christmas Jones.
What's your story? What are you doing here in Kazakhstan?
Avoiding those kind of questions, just like you.
And we have about another 45 minutes of screen time left at this point for them to never elaborate on this further. I talked about this some in my dedicated Dr. Christmas Jones video, but this character went through a bunch of changes through the scripting process. She was a French-Polynesian woman in the first draft of the script, and then that was changed because Elektra would be played by a French actress, and executives were giving notes on the character. The focus of the key creatives behind the camera was obviously on the Bond and Elektra relationship rather than the Bond and Christmas relationship, so ultimately, as much as I do love this character and Denise Richards in this part. Missed opportunities is perhaps one of the more apt phrases to describe how her character ended up on screen. As much as The World Is Not Enough is clearly trying to subvert elements of the Bond formula, it's also working hard to adhere to them at the same time, which is ultimately why Dr. Christmas Jones is here. I mean, it's a Bond film. Bond needs to have his leg over by the time the credits are rolling, right? As such, there is a bit of an obligatory sense to Christmas Jones's appearance in this film at all, but hey, as I say, I think that Denise Richards brings a good deal of fun and levity to the film. And hey, she is necessary to the plot. I mean, you know, there's all this nuclear stuff going on, and exposition that needs to be spouted, and Brosnan can't handle all of that by himself. It'd just be him monologuing, though maybe Brosnan would have actually preferred that. The scene ends with Bond having a brainwave as to where to head next, while we, the audience, head to Istanbul and Maiden's Tower, to be exact, where Elektra has set up residence. We're going to be in Istanbul for much of the climax, and it's a location that I really love every time it comes up in a Bond film. Here, Skyfall, most notably probably from Russia with Love, where you can even see Maiden's Tower in the background in some shots. There's just such a classic spy feel to the place. It's a setting that I really don't mind the series coming back to time and time again. Anyway, we spend some time with our villains here, who meet on screen in the film for the first time, and we get a lot of insights into their dynamics here. Right from the off, Elektra comes rushing into Renard's arms, and it's all very romantic, it seems, but then Elektra just kind of wants to get straight down to business.
Brought me something?
I just love the look on Renard's face there and the hold. It's like he's thinking, not even a "how was your day, honey? Sometimes I think you're only with me for my plutonium." And I think it creates an interesting dynamic here. There are going to be a few moments of the pair together where you really do get the sense that Renard is genuinely in love with Elektra. He seems to want to be romantic with her, but his impotence as a result of the bullet in his head prevents him from doing so, and he's awkward and quite sad as a result. Contrast this with Elektra, who is so gleeful about her evil scheme, and she's flaunting her sexuality here, being all naked and masturbating with ice right in front of the guy. The power dynamics between these two really fascinates me. There's an exchange between an imprisoned M and Renard here that certainly seems to, well, more than imply that both of these people, the pair of them, share some responsibility in turning Elektra into the villain she is.
I hope you're proud of what you did to her.
I'm afraid it is you who deserve credit. You ruined her. For what? To get to me.
In reality, I'm pretty sure we're not all just one traumatic kidnapping event away from wanting to nuke Istanbul, but Elektra and Renard have this really weird relationship dynamic in this film that I really do love. Like the idea that he abducted her, but then over the course of that experience, she came out on top and he was subservient to her. She ultimately ends up being the one with the most power in the relationship. Everything that Renard is doing, he's doing for her. I mean, he is going to kill himself ultimately for her evil goals, and I think that genuinely Renard does love Elektra, and I don't feel that that love is quite reciprocated. I get the sense that he's melancholy about how things have turned out. Like, maybe if he didn't have the bullet in his head, maybe him and Elektra could have gone on to be a romantic partnership, whereas with Elektra I feel like Renard is seen as a means to an end first, and a romantic partner second, or third, or fourth, or fifth. The pair even have a little bickering here, because Elektra's being all cold, presumably because Bond is dead, and Renard is seemingly jealous that he can't be a lover to Elektra like Bond was. The third draft of the script makes this a little more apparent, too. Originally, when Renard picks up Elektra and hugs her, he does it too hard, and she pushes him away. "You're hurting me," she says. Whether this was a result of him not knowing his own strength, or her own semi-repulsion at him being physical with her, I don't know, but it's an insightful little moment that I assume was at least partially filmed, as you can see some discomfort on Elektra's face during that moment as it plays out in the film, even though the line isn't there to call it out. I'm skipping a little bit ahead in the running time here, but while we're on this point, the pair's final scene together is really one of my favourite scenes in the film, and I think it just spells out their dynamic so perfectly.
And this is the end.
This is the beginning. The world will never be the same.
I think Robert Carlyle is really wonderful in these moments with Elektra. He manages to make Renard this by all accounts brutal terrorist. He manages to make him, if not sympathetic, then just pathetic, quite frankly, and I mean that in a good way. Seeing this supposedly terrible, dastardly man simping so hard for this woman who is clearly using him for her own means just gives him a whole other layer than if these two were just a demented and cackling evil couple. The pain on the man's face as he says, "Then this is the end," is kind of heart-wrenching, and then it's like Elektra senses he's maybe having some reluctance, so she tries to deflect this with encouraging talk of, no, it's just the beginning, we're gonna change the world, this is all wonderful and great, and when that doesn't seem to work, she has to just kiss him, and he clearly can't enjoy that, and is frustrated by it more than anything else, but that's kind of Elektra's finishing move, and what else is there to say? I guess off he goes, and she tootles on her merry way to asphyxiate Bond. The Raymond Benson novelization fleshes this moment out, as well as a few other crucial moments between Bond and Elektra. Again, I can't recommend enough for fans of the film to seek out this novelization. I think you'll get a lot out of it if you love The World Is Not Enough. So, as I say, the novelization expands on that moment where Renard and Elektra are saying goodbye in quite an interesting way. We get some of Elektra's thought process, which I think is really interesting. Renard handed her the hat, turned away, and walked back to the sub. Elektra watched him go with mixed emotions. She wanted to lash out at him, but at the same time she wanted to cradle the man in her arms. As he went through the hatch, he stopped and gave her one more longing look. She could have sworn there were tears in his eyes. She felt a lump in the middle of her chest, and for a few terrible seconds, she struggled against running to him. Renard mouthed the word goodbye, then disappeared into the sub. Elektra almost involuntarily cried out. She felt as if a part of her spirit was clawing its way out of her body. Damn it all, she thought. She was above this. Now was not the time for weakness. She had no use for feelings now. Elektra coldly cast away whatever warmth she still had in her soul. From that moment on, her heart became a block of ice. It was a confusing and unpleasant sensation, and it made her angry to experience these emotions. She had to divert the rage before it consumed her, and she knew just where she could redirect it. The novelization obviously has the ability to go into more details about the kidnapping, exactly when Elektra snapped, so to speak. And to be fair, we do get a lot of these details in the film as well, even if we don't see the actual event. We're led to believe it was specifically because M and Sir Robert didn't just opt to pay her ransom, which he could have easily afforded to get her out, and rather use her as a pawn to get close to Renard. It's that specific detail that made Elektra snap. And I mean, that fits in thematically, doesn't it? I mean, the whole film is really just about women manipulating men. I mean, there's Elektra and Renard, Elektra and Bond, and then on top of that we have M convincing Sir Robert to not pay his own daughter's ransom so that she would have more of a chance of apprehending a terrorist. I wonder how M went about convincing Sir Robert to go along with that. Earlier on, Bond mentioned Stockholm Syndrome as the reason for Elektra being in cahoots with Renard, and I think he initially massively underestimates how bonkers she is, actually, and this follows all the way through to her torturing him in the chair.
All this because you fell for Renard.
And that whole scene is essentially him coming to realize that, like, oh, this was all mainly because of you and not Renard, actually, while fighting getting an asphyxiation boner, but more on that later. It's open to interpretation whether you want to believe that Elektra was always a potential evil villainous mastermind and the kidnapping was the last straw that pushed her into it, or perhaps indeed, if, prior to the kidnapping she was entirely innocent, not a thought of nuking Istanbul in her mind. Did she merely adopt the dark, or was she born into it, molded by it even? Elektra and Renard are a couple of my all-time favourite Bond villains, and I think that the complexity of their relationship and their history makes them super compelling characters. I really love both Sophie Marceau and Robert Carlyle. I think they give fantastic performances, and I like that as interesting as I find their dynamic on screen, I do love speculating about their history together, what they're doing off screen, what's going on inside their heads. I find all that stuff really fun, and these two are honestly a huge reason behind why I love this film so much. I think of Elektra as the film's main villain, certainly, and Renard as her henchman. I mean, this whole scheme is her idea. But I do kind of also love that they're as bad as each other. They've corrupted and changed each other for the worst. It's a super toxic relationship, clearly, and I don't think that it's as simple as saying that, you know, Renard was the Dr. Frankenstein and he created Elektra the monster. I think it's a bit of a strange case of them both being Dr. Frankenstein and the monster at the same time. Anyway, I got really ahead of myself there. So in terms of plot, yes, Renard delivers the plutonium to Elektra and she responds by being all, "Oh hey, I got you a gift too, here's a Judi Dench." M is being held in a cell, and I love this moment where she's all by herself, she's clearly shitting it, wondering, how the hell am I gonna get out of this? And then the door opens and she immediately shifts to being all like casual looking, like, yes, can I help you? It's a nice little touch. Like I said earlier on, I like the vulnerability we get to see in M in this film, and she's not just some bulldog barking orders at everyone. Crucial plot point here where she remembers that she has the locator card that Bond gave her earlier and starts to formulate a plan as to how to utilize it along with a small clock that Renard has left in the room. Shame Q Branch don't apparently equip their own boss with some form of gadgets permissions. If they can put an inflatable orb in a ski jacket, I see no reason why they couldn't conceal a jetpack or something in a cream beige pantsuit, but no, she has to make do with just a stick. Back to Bond now, who has headed to the Caspian Sea to meet once again with Zukovsky at the guy's own caviar factory to follow up on the whole $1 million payoff from earlier. Zukovsky was unaware that Elektra was in cahoots with Renard, and Bond is keen to dig a bit deeper into what the caviar magnate knows. Before they're able to have much of a conversation, they are interrupted by buzzsaw-wielding, king-branded helicopters. Mr. Bullion, it turns out, is on Elektra's payroll, and he spies Bond's car and lets the heiress know where he is. And does she just have fleets of these things ready and waiting to go at barely a moment's notice? I mean, 5 minutes must pass between her getting the call and the buzzsaws arriving, but whatever, buckle up folks for one hell of an action scene. The whole caviar factory is suspended above water, and there are these wooden walkways and small buildings, and it's just an absolute delight to see these helicopters gliding through them and altering the landscape with such ease. A really brilliant idea to have these vehicles with these attachments in such a location. Fun fact, the buzzsaw helicopters were originally conceived as part of an action sequence for GoldenEye. They would have gone after Bond in his BMW Z3. Maybe such a sequence in that film would have been awesome, but I think that their use in The World Is Not Enough is just pitch perfect, so I'm glad that the idea came back to the filmmakers to reuse here. Bond's BMW, in this case the Z8, still gets a moment to shine though towards the start of the sequence. Bond is able to use its remote control features and missiles to take down one of the choppers before it's sawn in half. Clearly the filmmakers didn't want to do another GoldenEye and introduce a really cool car with gadgets and then do absolutely nothing with it. At the same time, Tomorrow Never Dies features a fairly phenomenal remote gadget-laden car chase, so they can't just repeat that same thing here 2 films in a row, so I think they have a good compromise here. Give the car a little badass moment and then play its incapacitation as a gag.
Q's not gonna like this.
I always feel so sorry for the thing when I hear that little beeping. It's like R2-D2 has been sawn in half. This is another action sequence bolstered by a wonderful soundtrack from David Arnold, and it features some really just awesome moments. I mean, I love Bond being chased along the walkway by the saw and then jumping over the side to narrowly avoid an explosion, the zip lining on a crowbar, all the while looking every bit the suave, debonair secret agent. Just adore Brosnan here, and there are little pepperings of humor throughout the scene that I just love as well. I also love that we get a little bit of pain face foreshadowing from Brosnan as his shoulder takes a beating, and I've always enjoyed this gag where he unknowingly takes out a goon with the trapdoor. I've always found Brosnan's line reading here really weird though. Why does he go so high-pitched? Get out! Still, makes for a great alarm clock though if you ever need motivation to get out of bed in the morning. Get out! Get out! Get out! Get out! Get out! Get out! If I absolutely have to ding the action sequence for anything, and again, this is minor quibbling, but I do feel like you lose a bit of a sense of geography at times, like where the characters are in relation to one another. It feels almost like a non-linear montage at one point. But hey, as I say, minor quibble, because I really do love this whole thing. I love that Zukovsky and Dr. Jones are really put through their own paces here too throughout the scene, and I just love the ending gag of Zukovsky being chased by these buzzsaws that have exploded off the final helicopter, and then in he goes into the caviar pit. Just brilliant, fun, love this entire bit of action. So yes, Zukovsky is floundering in his own caviar pit, and Bond of course takes this opportunity to interrogate the man. The payoff from earlier, it turns out, was in relation to Zukovsky's nephew smuggling some equipment for Elektra to Istanbul. So satisfied with this new lead, Bond allows Zukovsky to grab grab the end of his cane and he doesn't drown as a result. I really like the concept of this. It's kind of a comedic danger that Zukovsky is in, which feels appropriate for the moment. It's just the idea that he needs Bond to reach out with the cane in order for him to be able to get out is a bit weird, because, like, this pit, it's not that big or that deep. Why can't Zukovsky just grab the side of the tank himself? They could probably have solved this by just making the walls around Zukovsky higher so that he was truly trapped unless he was helped out, but as it is in the film, it's just a slightly strange moment because I don't know what they thought this would come out like, but ever since I was a kid, I've always just been like, why isn't he just grabbing hold of the side? Anyway, another fun fact for you, they filmed this scene on Robbie Coltrane's birthday, as Michael Apted mentions in the film's audio commentary.
And this was hell for Coltrane because it was his birthday. What a way to spend your birthday. We all sang to him, but I don't think it made it any easier.
Happy birthday, dear Robbie. Happy birthday. Back in Istanbul, a nuclear submarine arrives at the Maiden's Tower under the cloak of a tanker. Brilliant model work here that I genuinely never even questioned when I was a kid. I think it's really well done, but I do think it speaks to the power of Bond, especially after watching something like The Spy Who Loved Me. You know, the fact that you can just kind of take for granted that, of course, they would build these astonishingly large sets and shove a full-size submarine in. So the fact that this shot is actually a very well-done model just never even occurred to me. The next day, Bond and co arrive in the city, with Zukovsky taking the gang to the Federal Security Bureau to search for his nephew's submarine, and apparently this is the first time Bond is hearing this rather crucial bit of intel.
You know, in the old days, there were at least 100 places where a submarine could surface undetected.
Submarine?
You mean over the course of the whole ride over, Zukovsky never thought to disclose the information that his nephew is in charge of a nuclear submarine? I kind of like how this is called out in the script, with Bond asking, "A submarine? Why didn't you tell us?" And Zukovsky responds with, "It didn't come up." I guess when they were shooting, they probably thought it best to not call out the absurdity of the moment. We're about 100 minutes into the film now, and I've said this before, when I'm watching a Bond film, for fun, I am just rolling with the punches. I am not necessarily getting hung up on every little plot detail like I am when I make these videos. And I think I probably share that sentiment with the bulk of the audience at this point of the film, where we are all ready to launch into the climax. Bond and Christmas are able to put two and two together here and realize that Renard plans to put the stolen plutonium into the submarine's reactor and use the instant catastrophic meltdown to destroy Istanbul, making it seem like an accident that the sub went off, contaminating the Bosphorus for years, and, crucially, give the King pipeline a monopoly on transporting oil through the region. Back at Villain HQ, Renard meets with Nikolai, Zukovsky's nephew, and presents him with some poisoned food and drink for him and his crew.
Some brandy and refreshments for your mount.
Hey, the seal's broken on these Evian bottles. Just drink the damn water. Lucky for Renard that no one on that sub had specific dietary requirements that meant they couldn't enjoy a lovely meal of sandwiches and bananas. I'd love to know how they got the poison into the bananas without anyone noticing. Hey, these bananas look like they were taken out of the peel and put back in. Just eat the damn fruit. Impressive that there's presumably catering present at Maiden's Tower, or did Renard's men have to stay up all night and form an assembly line to make all these sandwiches? Anyway, sorry, I've spent way too long on the subject of Renard's refreshments. Oh, hey, now there's a name. Maybe if it wasn't for the bullet in his head and the old madness, Renard's true calling could have been in food. He could totally have opened a sandwich truck on a business park, called it Renard's Refreshments, and made an honest living. Would you like that with red sauce or brown? Okay, we're actually moving on now. The poison works and the sub-workers are killed. Renard's men move in, including this guy, who gets a rather prominent shot to himself, and so you may notice this guy is the same person who would go on to play Guy Haynes' bodyguard and get knocked off the roof in Quantum of Solace in a few films' time, and also the same man who did me the honor of agreeing to punch me in the face once a few years ago. In the novelization, a point is made that a bunch of Renard's men don't actually know that they're essentially committing suicide by going along with his scheme, and he's misleading them into coming on this venture, and Trukin, the guy from earlier, is still a prominent member of Renard's entourage in the book. In the film, there's most certainly not enough time to expand on this in any great detail, but I think it might have been interesting to at least hint at the idea of, you know, maybe Renard is some kind of like Charles Manson figure and he can recruit people who are willing to give their lives to his cause, or I don't know, maybe his sandwiches are just so great that you have one bite and you're happy to join his suicide cult. God, I should really have eaten my lunch before I filmed this. Meanwhile, Elektra pays a visit to M.
Good morning.
I love how Elektra looks a bit offended that M doesn't seem to be in the mood to make small talk with her. She's like, oh, all right then, be like that, but I can't blame M for not immediately jumping into a conversation about the morning's weather under the circumstances. M does a canny thing here and tricks Elektra into bringing her the clock after asking for the time.
It's time for you to die.
There's just no time to die. Oh, you should turn that into a song. You might even win an Oscar.
M uses the clock to activate the locator card, which allows Bond to pinpoint her exact location. Bullion takes the initiative here and sets off his briefcase explosive. I love how you actually see him carrying this thing around the caviar factory sequence earlier on, and he's clinging to it and looking terrified. It's clearly his insurance policy, and he's waiting for just the right moment to use it, and he does so here, and we get this brilliant moment. I just adore this shot in particular. It's clearly Richards and Brosnan doing this for real. The explosion is right behind them. It seems to completely engulf some of the stunt people behind them. It's a quick moment, but I think just the effects and stunt work here are just phenomenal. Love it. Bond and Christmas are able to escape. Unfortunately, Zukovsky seems to run into the direction of the explosion rather than away from it, and as such is knocked out at the very least. Bond and Christmas are immediately captured and taken to Maiden's Tower to be put in front of Elektra. She decides that Christmas is to be taken aboard the submarine, while she has a special torture chair seemingly just ready to go for Bond. We get the title name dropped in the dialogue here. It's a moment that I've always really liked.
I could have given you the world.
The world is not enough.
The World's Not Enough is just such a cool title / motto. It really surprises me that it took them 30 years after first using it on Her Majesty's Secret Service to mention it again.
Arms of Sir Thomas Bond, Baronet of Peckham, died 1734. Argent on a chevron sable. 3 besants. Good motto, eh? The world is not enough.
Foolish sentiment.
Family motto.
And then, yes, Elektra straps Bond into this chair. There's this protrusion pole thing that's pushing into the back of his neck further and further with each crank of the wheel. Elektra takes the opportunity to do some good villainous monologuing, and the penny seems to finally drop for Bond here that Elektra is actually the mastermind behind this whole thing.
You turned Renard.
Again, going back to my points earlier on about whether Elektra was truly turned evil through her kidnapping experience, whether she was always evil and it just tipped her over the edge, or indeed, if you really want to headcanon it this way, did Elektra manufacture her own kidnapping from the start with Renard? In both the novelization and dialogue from the film, I think it's fairly clear that we're supposed to believe that it was specifically the fact that her dad didn't pay the ransom that caused Elektra to turn evil. I think they kind of have to give the audience that as a clear reasoning for why she's doing what she's doing, but again, I think there's a lot of room here for the audience to read into her and Renard and their dynamic. As I say, I've spiraled into many different avenues of thought on this subject, and I kind of like that as an audience member you're invited to fill in the gaps and, in a way, draw your own conclusions about their relationship. We never get a full-on flashback of the kidnapping, and maybe in another universe that would have been the pre-credit sequence to this film, like Bond and another 00 going to rescue Elektra from Renard. It would certainly have been able to give us more of an objective sense of truth regarding the kidnapping and maybe their shifting power dynamics, which again is something that you get more in the novelization, but not on screen. The fact that this is all coming out during a torture scene too is really cool, and I think it speaks to something that you actually hear the screenwriters talking about in some of the behind-the-scenes interviews about, bringing it back to Fleming, and torture is a key element of Fleming's Bond. If cinematic Bond is defined by recurring elements and motifs like girls, gadgets, quips, literary Bond is more like a torture, cigarettes, melancholy, but yes, Bond is put through horrendous torture in pretty much all of the books, and it's something that comes around sporadically in the films, with this, I think, being one of the more overt instances. That Elektra gets kind of kinky with it too, feels very Fleming, mixing in some sexuality with the sadism. In general, I do think that The World's Not Enough is the most Fleming-esque of Brosnan's Bond films, and it's scenes like this that really do signal that, I think. Okay, so I've raved about this scene, and I do really love it. I think it's quite a brilliant scene, but I cannot deny that there is some unintentional hilarity to be had with Pierce Brosnan's pain face. Forgive me for not knowing where this term originated, but I feel like in Bond fan circles, if you use the term pain face, everybody knows what you're talking about. It's the jutting chin, the arched mouth, the exposed teeth. It's a staple move of Brosnan's Bond, actually, and for the most part, you know what, I think it's fine. I think that the guy here is supposed to be in tremendous pain, and Brosnan is having to display a escalating sense of it with each successive turn of the screw, and yes, it maybe gets a little bit silly, but I love it. I would not want to live live in a world where Brosnan wasn't pulling this face while staving off an erection from the double threat of asphyxiation and a gorgeous woman grinding his crotch. Fortunately for Bond, Zukovsky shows up and he is pissed, and I love that we get to see Zukovsky wielding a machine gun and tearing through Elektra's guards here. Zukovsky was in the KGB after all, so it's cool to see him in action, and he gets a great moment where he takes out Mr. Bullion.
So glad to see you. Me too.
Love it too when he bursts in on Elektra and Bond, and Zukovsky really takes in this scene in his stride, to be honest. There's very little, like, what the fuck is going on here? I even love how in the foreground, out of focus, you can see Elektra licking her lips, kind of like she's trying to come up with some semi-plausible explanation for this. Zukovsky notices his nephew's cap, and Elektra uses it to blindside the man and shoot him. She wasn't counting on him having his own concealed weapon, though, in his cane. I just adore this moment, how it's shot and edited. I think it's so wonderfully tense, and I like that Zukovsky uses his smarts here. He's like, yeah, you know, could shoot Elektra, and to be honest, that'd probably be the more satisfying immediate act of revenge for the guy, but hey, he's dying here, and he realizes that it's better to help Bond escape, so he shoots off one of the cuffs, and then for all intents and purposes, seemingly, according to the script at least, he dies. Or does he? If you're a regular to this channel, then you're probably familiar with my borderline fanatical theorizing that Zukovsky actually survives this whole experience, and indeed, I don't think it's a super definitive screen death. I mean, no pulse is checked, no obituary is written, no body vaporized before our eyes, so my main source of this theorizing comes from a slightly tenuous source, maybe, the 007 Spy Files magazine, which I was indeed subscribed to back in the early noughties, and they did character profiles in every issue, and there would be a current status listed as to whether the characters were alive or dead, and for Zukovsky, the status was listed as believed deceased. While I highly doubt that the film screenwriters themselves would have been writing these character bios in these magazines, this is nonetheless an officially Eon-sanctioned product, so I think it must speak to some official line about the character, surely. What I suspect is that, I mean, everyone loves Robbie Coltrane, the Valentin Zukovsky character is an awful lot of fun, so they were probably fudging it a little bit, just in case they did want to bring him back. Like, if Brosnan had come back for a 5th full Bond film, maybe they could have brought him back, and maybe he would have a limp in his other leg as well, as a result of getting shot by Elektra. The magazine was written in 2002, and obviously Daniel Craig came along in 2006, the whole timeline rebooted, so this is perhaps a moot point these days, because I don't think we're ever going to be going back to this original 20-film timeline, but damn it, I love Valentin Zukovsky, and in my headcanon, he's alive. Anyway, I do love the final exchange of looks between him and Bond. It gets me every time. And then, of course, Bond is able to escape. Elektra's bodyguard Gabor turns up, creating a distraction for Elektra to run away. And I love how Gabor is like a boss battle here. Bond has to shoot him 6 times to take him down before he can give chase to Elektra up the tower. And she's seemingly really enjoying this.
James, you can't kill me. Not in cold blood.
Bond is also able to free M here, and I just love her reaction when he bursts in and starts flailing his gun all around the place before shooting the lock. I mean, to be fair to him, though, if he'd have missed and accidentally killed her, I mean, he'd had a perfect excuse, like, oh yeah, she was like this when I found her. Bond eventually makes up to the top where Elektra is stood waiting. The pair have a tense moment, Elektra is smiling at him, and just going back to what I was talking about earlier regarding exactly how manipulative Elektra is, like, don't get me wrong, she's manipulative in this moment. She's smirking at him, looking all cutesy, but personally, I do like to think that in some twisted way she is, like, really into Bond. I don't know if she loves him in a traditional sense, but earlier on when she says,
If only you'd kept away, we might have met again in a few years and become lovers once more.
I do believe her. I think that in her head, at one point she was probably like, okay, I'll do all this stuff with Renard and I'll get my own way with the oil pipeline, and then once it's all over, maybe I could settle down or something with this James Bond guy. I think that she does have feelings for him, and yeah, in a parallel universe, maybe they'd have been a cute couple and spent every Friday night masturbating each other with ice cubes. Alternatively, I suppose you could interpret Elektra as the master manipulator who doesn't actually care for Bond or Renard, and when she's smirking and looking all cute here, it's really that she's just admiring her own handiwork. Like, she's just so confident that he's not going to kill her, because in her head, she's the dominant exploiter. To this point, she's gotten these men to do exactly what she wanted them to do. They are the pawns, and she is the queen. Or, I guess, king in this instance. Do let me know your own interpretations below. Again, I do just love how, as an audience member, you can read so much into little moments like this. It's one of the main reasons why I love this film so so much and why I think about it an awful lot. I mean, I think about all of the Bond films an awful lot, but I think about this an especially awful lot. I think Brosnan and Marceau play this scene wonderfully. I love that Bond is quite clearly into this woman, and he is willing her here to call off Renard to save the city, but also, perhaps even more so, to save herself, because he knows what he has to do if she does not comply, and unfortunately for all involved, she doesn't.
Dive, Bond!
It'd totally spoil the emotional moment, admittedly, but I've always kind of wondered what Renard's reaction to this is on the other end of the walkie-talkie. Like, he's on the submarine and he just hears, "Dive, Bond!" It's like, what's his reaction to that?
Dive, Bond!
This is just like last night when she called his name instead of mine during our lovemaking.
More importantly, though, this is, to date, the most direct kill Bond has ever had with a female character on screen. Female villains are surprisingly a rarity in this series, and oftentimes they're killed in the middle of action sequences. The point of this kill, though, is that it's cold, that it's direct, and I think it's a very powerful moment as a result of that. I think it's an interesting choice, too, that when Elektra is dead on the bed, M appears at the top of the stairs, and we're suddenly seeing things from her perspective. We're not with Bond as he leans over to caress Elektra's body. During the showdown, there's lots of close-ups back and forth between both Bond and Elektra, and it puts the audience right in the middle of it. But for this more tender, more personal moment, the camera stays further back and we're observing the moment along with M. There is not a close-up of Bond's face here. If anything, his face is obscured intentionally by the angle of the camera, and I think that's an interesting choice, and one that I think helps prevent the moment from feeling too overly sentimental. Also, if I had a penny for every time Brosnan's Bond caressed a dead lover, I'd have 2 pennies, but it's weird that it's happened twice. Bond leaves the corpse with his boss and dives after Renard's submarine into the action climax of the film, which sees Bond and Christmas doing battle throughout the confines of the submarine's layout. It's obviously not as big and showy as bespoke villains' bases are, but considering the previous film had a climax set piece on a villain's aquatic base of operations, to be honest, I don't even think the similarities with this even occurred to me until many years later, but I do think that some work clearly went into this to making sure that both the climaxes stood on their own. I love that Bond is once again kind of improving on the fly here, and to his own detriment really. During a firefight, he kind of runs the submarine into the ground, which is unhelpful for his goals, but I do love how this effectively flips the environment for the rest of the climax now that the sub is at an angle. I think it's just a really wonderful touch, and I love the new challenges this poses for the heroes. In order to get to Renard in the reactor room, Bond must climb outside of the submarine and get in through another hatch from the outside of it, like similar to the bit in Tomorrow Never Dies where Bond and Waylon are escaping an underwater vessel without air. When I'd watch these scenes as a kid, I'd often be holding my breath along with Bond to see if I could last as long as him, to the point that I'd be struggling with breath and getting annoyed at Dr. Jones myself for not hitting the damn button soon enough. But she eventually succeeds, and Bond enters the reactor room where Renard is attempting to cause the nuclear meltdown by placing his big rod in a little hole. A villain, semi-defined by his own impotence, having to insert a phallus into an opening in order to achieve ultimate satisfaction. No symbolism to unpack there. I guess this is an instance where Renard's depleting senses are used against him. Bond comes bursting into the room, causing water to drip down onto the villain, which I guess he can't feel, otherwise he'd have been alerted to Bond's presence, but it's a small moment, and the two ultimately do get to fighting pretty quick. Bond must forego his upper hand to rescue a soggy Christmas Jones, and I can think of 2 very good reasons why the audience might not argue with his decision-making process here. I like that the final fight is taking place in and amongst these bars. It gives the characters an excuse to swing around and into each other and search. Bond tells Renard here that Elektra is dead, which might not have been the best time to do so, as the news seems to supercharge the villain. I think it's a shame that his whole sensory breakdown thing doesn't get used to great effect here, possibly because it would have inevitably led to things being a bit too gory, because I guess one of the only ways to really utilize it would have been to have Bond inflicting massive damage on Renard that would have incapacitated any normal person, but Renard just wouldn't feel it, and he'd be able to keep going. So, like, you know, you could chop off the guy's legs and arms and he'd still be up for a fight. Actually, maybe it's a good job they didn't go down that route. It'd all get a bit Monty Python, wouldn't it?
Look, you stupid bastard, you've got no arms left.
It's just a flesh wound. I bring it up because oftentimes in the series, villains are defeated by Bond using their special skills or attributes against them. Oddjob is electrocuted via his razor-rimmed hat. Jaws' metal teeth allow Bond to drop him into a shark tank using a gigantic magnet. Asphyxiation enthusiast Xenia is crushed against a tree until she suffocates. It feels odd that Renard's affectation doesn't factor much into the action. I mean, you could really lose his whole sensory thing from the script completely, and plot-wise, I don't think it'd make that much of a difference. You could argue, I suppose, shows that unless Renard was essentially terminal, he wouldn't be willing to kill himself for Elektra's scheme, but I think that's about it, really. What I do think it does is work on a character and thematic level. As I mentioned earlier, the scenes where he's with Elektra and he's frustrated at his own impotence, the fact he can't enjoy life, presumably. Elektra's motto is there's no point in living if you can't feel alive, and Renard literally can't feel, so ergo, what's the point of him being alive in his head? But also, just to make him sympathetic in a way, I think that if he didn't have that specific affectation, I don't think I'd feel anything resembling empathy towards this awful man who has done so many heinous things, and yet I think Carlyle gives a sympathetic, layered performance. I think he's a really strong Bond villain henchman, however you want to categorize him. Anyway, Renard gets the upper hand in the fight, but Bond is able to improv with a tube and a flashy light to ultimately impale Renard with his own rod. Might need some help unpacking any potential symbolism there, but this is indeed the killer blow that ends the villain's life. Love how psychotic Bond looks here as he sees Renard die. He's really enjoying this moment, and again, this is just something that feels so Fleming-esque to me. So both villains are dead, nuclear meltdown is pretty much averted, but there's this awkward little bit of business here where Christmas says that just one spark and the reactor will blow, so she needs to stop it. Bond then starts letting water into the reactor room, telling Christmas that he'll meet her in the torpedo room, and then we cut to an exterior of the sub, and then we cut back in, and Bond and Christmas are indeed heading to the torpedo chutes, while Bond has some clunky, clearly ADR'd lines to reassure the audience that when the sub explodes, it is not in fact going to be a nuclear explosion.
The reactor is flooded, so it's safe even if this place blows.
This always confused me as a kid. I could never quite understand how the submarine could explode, but it wouldn't be a nuclear explosion, even though all of the nuclear material is in the submarine. And yeah, I guess they fudge it a bit because, hey, both villains are dead. We've just snuck over 2 hours in the running time, and we're all just kind of ready to call it a day, right? I mean, not me, obviously. I could see the film go on for another 2 hours, but I suppose more general audiences might be ready to leave. I always wish there was a slightly more elegant way for them to cover this exposition, but whatever. The pair go shooting out of the submarine, the thing explodes, and the pair are picked up by a local tourist boat. Back to Scotland now, as M reappears at the scene, and straight back to work. All very British here, no one really acknowledging at all what she had to go through. I hear you had to shit on a bucket, Mom.
Utter one more syllable and I'll have you shot.
I love how when we get this establishing shot of the scene, you can just see in the background Moneypenny is sat in the big chair at the desk and is being brought tea. Like, alright Moneypenny, someone's getting ideas above their stations here, sitting in the boss's chair. Like, love that the next time we see this scene as well, M is back in the main seat while Moneypenny is stood next to her. Presumably as punishment, Moneypenny is going to be forced to stand for at least 3 months. I love also that M was able to get from Istanbul to Scotland, and yet MI6 are having a devil of a time locating where Bond is. Like, M would have had a better shot at finding him if she'd have just stayed on the balcony at Maiden's Tower looking across the water, but okay, whatever. This is the Millennium Bond film, so of course we are going to end with a fireworks show. Given that the bank statement at the start of the film gave the date as the 15th of November, 1999, we can indeed assume that this final scene is taking place at some point in December, though the film is not going to explicitly say that this is either New Year's Eve or Christmas Eve. I mean, Bond is going to make a Christmas joke, so we're clearly at just some nondescript date towards the end of 1999. MI6 do eventually locate Bond after first finding his Aston Martin DB5 on a satellite camera, and again, would love to know how and when that thing got shipped out to Istanbul for him, but anyway, we get a classic instance of MI6 officials becoming involuntary voyeurs when Bond and Christmas's heat signatures are picked up on camera. John Cleese and Michael Kitchen bringing some excellent side-eye game to proceedings, and we of course wrap things up with one of the most raucous lines to end any Bond film.
I thought Christmas only comes once a year.
Obviously, as a kid watching this, I didn't know what that meant. I just thought like, oh, I guess she gave him his present early. And then I grew up. In what was a really exciting move at the time, the end credits began with James Bond Will Return, something that was typically placed towards the very end of the credits at this point in the series, and we are treated to a wonderful David Arnold Bond theme remix to end one of my favourite films of all time. And yes, you heard that right, I'm not just talking about Bond films here, I'm talking about all films. If I get stranded on a desert island and I've got a choice between The World Is Not Enough and Citizen Kane, it's a no-brainer. I think The World Is Not Enough is a more ambitious film than it's generally given credit for, and it's certainly laid a lot of groundwork for creative choices and directions that I think would be more fully exploited and perhaps even more embraced in the Daniel Craig films, putting more emphasis on the characters and emotional relationships. It's obviously a course correction from Tomorrow Never Dies, which, I mean, yes, in that film there was the whole Bond and Paris thing, but that was resolved with an hour left of the film. The World Is Not Enough gives the likes of Brosnan, Dench, Marceau and Carlyle some good, meaty, actorial tour scenes to really sink their teeth into. If I hadn't made it clear throughout the course of this review, I really love what all four of these actors bring to the film, but I do just want to highlight Brosnan here, especially in this wrap-up. Like, yes, there's pain face, yes, there's some weird line delivery choices in places, but damn it, I love what he is doing in this film, and perhaps it's just because I watched this film over and over and over again when I was younger, but the man just exemplifies everything I think James Bond should be in this film. Almost every move he makes, he just oozes the character. He's so suave, so cool, so tough, so funny. I'm always flip-flopping when it comes to citing which film is each of the Bond actors' best performance, but The World's Not Enough is an easy contention for Brosnan's. I just adore him in this film. The film is a return to Fleming in a lot of ways, evoking On Her Majesty's Secret Service, of course, choosing a title that has its roots in that story, bringing in elements like the torture chair, exploring some psychosexual dynamics. These are things that didn't register with me that much when I was first watching the film, as it would take me a few years to get around to reading the books, but now I feel like I read more into the film on each successive rewatch as a result of being so immersed in literary Bond, and not even just Fleming, but the continuation novels too. The film in many ways represents the ultimate Bond nostalgia for me personally. I'm under no illusions that this film is far from being universally beloved. If anything, loving the film goes against the grain a bit, but damn it, I've met a lot of fellow Bond fans who love this film to bits, and those of us that love it really do adore it, and feel quite protective of it in some ways. It's the Millennium Bond film, and in many ways I think it resonates the most with millennial Bond fans. I'm making this video in the 25th anniversary year of the film's release, a pretty big milestone, and yet I don't feel like the film has received all that much official love, or certainly not as much as other Bond films celebrating their anniversaries in 2024 have. It's with things like these, though, that I think the fan base really comes alive. We all love our own underrated favourites in the series, and while that word may well be overused in Bond fan circles, if I was strapped into a torture chair and had to single out just a single Bond film to mark as underrated, it would indeed be The World Is Not Enough, a film that I find every bit as thrilling, funny, charming, and exciting as I did when I first saw it. Here's to the next 2.5 decades. Thank you so much for joining me on this pipeline speed through why I love The World Is Not Enough so much. Please do let me know your own thoughts on the film in the comments section below. You can also hit the subscribe button and the Mrs. Bell notification button to stay up to date on future video uploads. There are links to my various social media pages below if you want to follow me on any of those sites. And remember, Bond fans, there's no point in living if you're not subscribed to the Calvin Dyson YouTube channel, so hit the subscribe button, and until next time, Bond fans, so long for now.